Story 1. Megan could no longer contain her trembling. "Robert, this is a bad idea," she said. "I want to go back. Let's take the usual route. It's very late already. Greenfield Park has been closed for many years, and who knows what's happening here now. I'm scared, Robert. Let's just walk." "We've already talked about this," Robert interrupted, a note of frustration in his voice. "You agreed it would be much quicker this way." "Yes, I agreed. But I didn't think we'd have to walk through the park at night," she pleaded, her eyes searching his for understanding. "Megan?" Robert sighed, stopped, and turned to face his girlfriend, gently embracing her to calm her down. He wasn't thrilled about walking through the closed Greenfield Park either, but they were running late, and his boss, who had invited them to the party, did not appreciate tardiness. "We don't have time to take the usual route, and if we don't make it on time, I'm worried my boss will give the project to someone else. You have to understand, Megan." Megan sighed deeply and gazed into the park. All she could see were trees shrouded in darkness, and it frightened her. "There are no street lights in the park at night." Megan made one last desperate attempt to dissuade him. "We have the flashlights on our phones," Robert dismissed her concerns. "Come on, don't panic. It's not that far. I roughly remember the path. I used to come here a lot as a kid. We're running out of time, Megan." "Okay," she exhaled, biting her lip and trying to suppress the feeling that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. "Everything will be fine," he reassured her, gently touching her tightly pursed lips, and took her hand. "I'm with you," his fingers gripping her wrist firmly, offering her a sense of security. "Let's go." "Let's go," Megan nodded, attempting to shake off all her fears. For a brief moment she even succeeded, but then memories of all the rumors associated with this place began to resurface in her mind, sending a new wave of tremors through her body. The last rumor she remembered was about some ritualistic animal killings. Her friend had told her in a terrified whisper about cultists worshipping demons who roamed their small town at night, often seen near Greenfield Park. At the time she had just laughed it off, but now she was scared. At the entrance to the park, Megan saw a strange symbol on the ground. It was an inverted cross with something that looked like fangs. "Robert," she said, stopping abruptly. "What's wrong?" He turned around. She pointed at the symbol. "It's just graffiti, probably a prank by some kids," he said, moving ahead. Greenfield Park was enclosed by a hedge, and the entrance was blocked by heavy wrought iron gates. However, the lock had been broken for a long time, allowing anyone to enter. Yet many locals avoided the area because of various rumors. Robert turned back as the heavy wrought iron gates slowly creaked open, their rusty hinges squeaking. A sudden gust of wind stirred up a pile of last year's leaves, rustling them in a sound that Megan thought sounded like whispering voices. "Oh my God, did you hear that?" Megan gasped, pressing closer to Robert as she scanned their surroundings. "What?" Robert replied, his voice tinged with confusion. "Did you see something?" Instead of answering, Megan simply sighed, her breath visible in the chilly air. It had grown unexpectedly cold. "They said on the radio it was going to be warm tonight. They were wrong. We need to hurry before it starts raining. Feel how cold it's getting? That's why we need to keep moving. Don't fall behind and watch your step," Robert said in a calm tone, though his nervous lip-licking betrayed his anxiety. "There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just dark. Turn on your phone's flashlight. Just don't let go of me, okay?" she asked, gripping his hand tighter. Without a word, Robert intertwined their fingers and pressed his lips to her warm wrist. Together, they stepped into the park's darkness. The last things Megan remembered were a howl that filled the air, a sudden icy chill, and then a sharp pain that overwhelmed her senses. Cold. Damp. A heavy weight on her chest made it difficult to breathe. Megan groaned as she slowly opened her eyes, her movements more instinctive than deliberate. Leaves, withered grass, twigs, and damp earth surrounded her. A hollow emptiness overwhelmed her, and panic began to set in. She tried to turn her head and winced at the sharp pain. Clenching her teeth, she managed to lift her hand to her head and felt a large, tender bump under her tangled hair. For a few moments, she lay still, trying to gather her strength, then tried to move again. This time, the pain was more tolerable. Carefully avoiding any sudden movements, she tried to sit up and look around. Only the looming trees and rustling bushes met her gaze. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. All was silent. She struggled to recall what had happened before she lost consciousness. Robert. Where was he? Her heart pounded, pushing the pain to the background. Pushing herself to her feet, Megan turned and froze, staring at a spot a few feet away where he lay. Groaning, Megan with great effort moved toward the figure that now resembled a broken doll more than a human. She fell to her knees, almost crying from relief when she saw his chest rise and fall under his torn shirt. He was alive. Her tension eased slightly, but her body shivered uncontrollably from the cold. Megan touched his wrist and quickly pulled back her hand. His skin was burning hot. "Robert," she called hoarsely to her beloved, reaching out to him again. She brushed strands of hair from his face and gasped in horror, examining his lips, which were swollen and blistered. "Robert," she sobbed, feverishly checking his body for injuries. Aside from a few bruises and scratches, there were no other visible wounds. "Robert," she whispered, gently tapping his cheeks. She longed to kiss him, to feel his breath against her lips, but the blisters deterred her, fearing she might cause him more pain. "Darling, don't scare me. Open your eyes. Wake up." The man's eyelashes twitched. He exhaled, and then suddenly cried out softly. His hand flew up, but the girl intercepted it, preventing him from touching lips. "Don't," she said, managing a forced smile as she held his gaze. Eyes that were filled with pain, fear, and confusion. Robert tried to speak, but Megan tightened her grip on his fingers. "Don't talk. You're injured." Robert simply stared at her for a moment, then closed his eyes, masking his pain as his body relaxed. Megan bit her lip and reached for her phone. They needed help, but she would have to process the night's events later, like why her wrists bore bruises from his grip, and why her face felt tight, as if she had been crying all night. At the hospital. "How is he doing?" Megan asked, unable to bring herself to lie down, remaining seated as the doctor entered. "Much better. It's surprising how quickly his burn is healing," the doctor replied, shaking his head in amazement. "Just yesterday, he couldn't even move his lips, but today he's able to use a straw." Megan recalled how long it had taken for Robert's last cut to heal and frowned. "When can we go home?" she asked, putting her worries aside for the moment. "You can be discharged in the next few days, but he'll need to stay longer," the doctor replied. Megan sighed, deciding not to question the doctor's advice. Robert truly needed the care. "Can I see him?" "Only if you promise not to overexert him and to rest afterward," the doctor conceded, stepping aside. In Robert's room. "Hey," Megan said as she opened the door, offering a warm smile. Robert turned from the window, his expression softening. He reached out his hands, and she, taking his warm fingers, sat beside him on the bed. They simply looked at each other for several long moments before Megan began to gently kiss his palms and wrists. Megan. Robert exhaled and winced as the crust over his burn cracked. Don't talk. She quickly leaned in and softly blew on his lips. Just hang on a little longer. To avoid meeting his sorrow-filled gaze, Megan buried her face in his palms. Why was he so warm? As if he were on fire. She resolved to ask the doctor about it later. You'd better go, the nurse interrupted their quiet moment. It's time for his treatment. Megan grimaced, caught Robert's pleading look, and reluctantly stood up, letting go of his hand. Everything will be okay, she whispered, smiled gently, and left the room, feeling a chill set in. As the initial shock subsided, fear and realization crept in. Megan's heart pounded instinctively, and with a soft sigh, she turned to her other side. In the dark, the door seemed to morph into a window, revealing a night sky dotted with faint, barely visible stars. She attempted to count them for a while, but soon dizziness overwhelmed her, and she closed her eyes. Her mind drifted back to that evening. What had happened? Aside from the concussion, the bruises, the scrapes, and the burns, there had been no violence. Nothing was stolen. Their money and other valuables were untouched, though their clothes were torn. The police had combed the entire park but found nothing. Who had attacked them, and what did they want? The bruises on her arms felt as if someone had gripped her forcefully, as if trying to break free. And Robert. His lips looked as if he had been kissed by fiery lips. Suppressing a sudden wave of jealousy, Megan tried to recall anything else from that night, but her memory refused to cooperate. The door to the room clicked open with a soft, unpleasant squeak, and Megan froze, clutching the blanket and staring wide-eyed at the window where fear was mirrored in her eyes. Behind her, she sensed an intense, unsettling gaze that sent shivers down her spine, a mix of cold and heat. Footsteps approached, and her blood turned icy, but before she could shut her eyes, a dark silhouette appeared against the window. Megan swallowed hard, and then suddenly, it was all over. "Darling?" Robert's quiet voice broke the thick silence, nearly bringing her to tears. "You scared me," she said with a trembling voice, sitting up in bed. Then it dawned on her. "Robert, why are you here?" "Sorry." He quickly climbed onto the bed, his tone apologetic. "I had a nightmare, got scared, wanted to be with you, and I—" "Robert?" Megan, struggling to understand what her beloved was saying, reached out to him, and taking his chin, turned his head towards the dim light streaming in from the window. Broken shadows lay on the man's face. His skin seemed to glow, but the girl couldn't see it. There was almost nothing left of the burn. Enchanted, she ran her fingertip along his lower lip, sincerely enjoying its softness, but something was off. "Robert, where's your scar?" she asked. He furrowed his brow, puzzled, and licked his lips. "I don't know," he replied, his expression turning serious. "I guess it disappeared along with the burn." He shrugged nonchalantly a moment later and smiled. "How is that possible? Just earlier tonight you couldn't talk." "I really don't know." He became serious too. "It's like having gaps in my memory. I remember the park, you holding my hand. Then the hospital. I remember being scared. Strange dreams, confusing thoughts." Robert pondered. After a moment of silence, he added, "Then I wandered around the hospital looking for you. But I thought it was all just a dream. And when I found you, it felt like waking up," he concluded. Megan hugged him, resting her head against his chest, drawing comfort from his presence. "We're alive, together, and I want everything to go back to how it was. But something feels off. I can't pinpoint it. It just scares me." Megan paused, her voice laden with concern, and then looked up at Robert. "Why are you so warm? Where have your scars and burns gone? And the bruises, they've just vanished. It's all so strange," she murmured, her fingers tightening around his. There has to be an explanation. Perhaps it's all the aftermath of shock, fear from the unknown, and the burns disappeared due to treatment. "Medicine has made huge advances recently," he replied, trying to reassure her. "I don't want to think about the worst. You're right. There must be an explanation. Right now, I just want to be with you," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Forgive me," he whispered. "If only I had listened to you back then." "I went after you on my own. Don't blame yourself. Let's just not think about it for now." Megan shook her head, dismissing the thought. "You don't want to find out what happened?" Robert asked, genuinely surprised. He remembered Megan as timid yet always curious. "I do and I don't," she looked away, conflicted. "But whenever I try to forget, I can't help but wonder, what if it happens again?" "It won't happen again if we stay away from the park." "You're right. Let's just forget it all," Robert suddenly declared with an unexpected firmness. Megan's brow furrowed as she detected an unfamiliar tone in Robert's voice. Authoritative, sharp, cold. "If that's what you want, I do," Robert said abruptly, his demeanor shifting, becoming distant. "Okay," Megan breathed out cautiously, a chill running through her as she felt a cold touch on her heart. What was happening? "I have to go back," he said as he stepped away. His features became indistinct, but Megan could still see his eyes clearly, their dim glow unsettling. She blinked, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. When she looked again, Robert was already at the door. "See you tomorrow, sweetheart. Try to get some sleep and don't worry about anything." The door creaked shut, and Megan was left alone. She took a deep breath, and only then realized how tense she had been. What just happened? It couldn't have been her imagination, could it? Robert had always been different, yet he had always been himself. She had felt his presence, recognized him beyond any facade. But now, just minutes ago, he had been kissing her lips, and then he had changed. The person who left the room, she didn't recognize him. A branch tapped against the window glass, startling Megan, who quickly ducked under the covers. It's all the fault of the night and the aftermath of the concussion. Everything will look different in the morning. A few days later, Megan sat in the cafe, her hands trembling as she tried to steady them enough to sip her coffee. Her initial attempt failed, and she muttered a curse under her breath. Taking a deep breath and counting to 10, she managed to calm her nerves slightly. She tried again, this time the hot coffee scalding her throat and leaving a bitter aftertaste. Gradually, the tension began to subside. Taking another sip, she turned to the window and grimaced at her reflection. Dark circles under hollow eyes, chapped lips, pale skin, and disheveled hair. "Can I get you anything else?" the waiter asked, appearing beside her table. Megan barely glanced at him before responding curtly, "Nothing, thanks." He disappeared, and Megan immediately regretted not ordering something stronger to drink. A craving to drown her senses in alcohol washed over her, wishing to obliterate all thoughts, especially the fear of the coming night and the dread of returning home. Her mind flashed back to that horrifying night. "Robert, what are you doing?" Megan had frozen in the doorway of the kitchen, staring wide-eyed as Robert devoured a piece of raw meat. The refrigerator door was open, its hum piercing the silence that had awakened her. "Eating," Robert replied indifferently, his gaze fixed on his gruesome task. blood and grime mixing on his lips and fingers, which he seemed to relish with disturbing enjoyment. Megan's head spun, a nightmare seeming to clutch at her heart. Robert. She exhaled helplessly, feeling utterly lost for the first time in her life. Go back to bed, he finally said, lifting his eyes to hers. Megan recoiled as she saw his pupils constrict to slits and then dilate fully. His teeth, now resembling fangs and smeared with blood, sent a surge of terror through her. Silently, she turned and retreated to the bedroom, curling under the covers and staring blankly ahead, trying to will herself to wake from this nightmare. By morning, Robert was hysterical, staring in horror at his blood-stained fingers, retching over chunks of spoiled meat in the bathroom. He later collapsed into a deep sleep in Megan's arms, crying and trembling. "Megan, what's happening to me?" His voice was laced with terror and confusion. His gray eyes, filled with desperate hope, searched hers for answers. "I don't remember anything. Why did I do this? Why?" Megan could only bite her lip, holding him close, unable to provide any comfort with words. Nighttime was now Megan's enemy. As the sun set and twilight deepened, fear seeped into her heart. Daylight offered some respite, allowing her to avoid seeing the dark circles that had formed around Robert's nearly pallid skin, and the perpetual sorrow that seemed to reside in his eyes, displacing any flicker of hope. They could still play along, pretending all was well, each too afraid to confront their shared pain and fear. "No, Megan, no," Robert whispered fervently, his eyes pleading with her. "They'll commit me to a psychiatric hospital. Sweetheart, I'm still me. I can handle this. Just stay with me. Don't leave me." And Megan stayed. She watched his exhausted face during the day and prayed to every deity she knew at night. Because at night Robert transformed and it terrified her. His voice grew deeper, more animalistic, and Megan couldn't decipher his words. Dogs in the neighborhood howled and pulled at their chains, while Robert only smirked, displaying a row of unnaturally sharp teeth and fangs. Megan no longer left the bedroom at night. As soon as he rose from bed and vanished into the dark corridor, she curled up under the covers, her teeth clenched, as she listened to the rustling and the increasingly familiar growl of Robert's voice. The palpable fear made her flinch when footsteps neared the door. It was terrifying, unnerving, because it was Robert, her gentle, loving Robert. It was he who lay beside her each evening, who clung to Megan with a desperation as if trying to become one with her. But as soon as his gray eyes closed, the nightmare began. Robert didn't touch her, didn't speak to her. It was as if he didn't see her at all. And only in the morning. Megan embraced her real Robert. She soothed him, urged him to sleep. And she watched over his sleep, holding his hand and gently caressing his worn face with her fingertips. He was her beloved, frightened, exhausted, the most beautiful, the most dear, the same Robert whom she couldn't help. While sitting in the cafe, Megan remembered another night, one unlike any other. The stillness that enveloped the house was even more unsettling than the rustling and the growling voice of Robert, to which she had almost grown accustomed. It felt as though the air itself was laden with fear, and a metallic taste lingered on her tongue. Something had changed. This sensation gnawed at her, made her bite her lips. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Megan slipped from bed and moved silently out of the bedroom. She traversed the corridors, descended the stairs to the ground floor, and paused at the foot of the stairs, listening intently to the sounds within the house. In the dim light of the hall, the shapes of objects seemed distorted, as if in a funhouse mirror. The silence was deafening, her own breathing oppressively loud. "Where are you?" Megan mouthed, but her throat produced no sound. as if too frightened to break the deathly quiet. And then she was answered. A draft caressed her bare feet, and the sound of the window frame tapping startled her. Shivering, Megan hesitantly turned towards the partially open living room door. After a moment's hesitation, she pulled the door towards herself, stepped into the room, and froze, her throat constricting. Robert stood by the large mirror, holding a thin, sharp knife, smiling as he watched the thin streams of blood trickle down his face, which appeared almost black in the dim light. Cuts on his forehead, almost at the temple, formed a bizarre pattern, but Megan's mind felt numb, registering the scene without trying to analyze it. She watched, transfixed, as his pink tongue slid over his lips, licking the drops of blood. There was no fear yet. That came later. When Robert looked directly at her, and Megan saw no whites or irises in his eyes, only an absolute terrifying blackness. "Do you like it?" he asked in a hoarse, chilling voice, tilting his head to the side and observing Megan's reaction with interest. "You..." Megan swallowed and moistened her dry lips. "Why?" she asked calmly, her voice slow, though she wanted nothing more than to flee from Robert. "Do you like it?" he repeated, as if he hadn't heard her question. "No," Megan exhaled. She turned away, conscious of his intense gaze on her back. As she took a step forward, a sharp, pain-filled scream echoed behind her, followed by a dull thud. Instantly, Megan spun around and, without a second thought, dashed to where her beloved now lay unconscious on the floor. Nearby, a knife with a blade stained with dried blood gleamed in the dim light. "Robert," she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him and gently rolling him onto his back. "Robert, what happened?" He groaned softly and his eyes fluttered open, those gray eyes clouded with confusion. "Megan, what?" He reached up, his fingers brushing against the cuts, and he winced. "Don't touch. They need to be treated," she said urgently. Robert pulled away from her, staggered to the mirror, and froze, horror widening his eyes. "What is this?" His hands trembled, and his voice broke as he cried out. "Who did this?" "You did it yourself," Megan replied, her voice a mix of relief and horror, aware that today's ordeal was over but uncertain about what tomorrow would bring. "Megan," he murmured after a moment of heavy silence, his head bowed, his face partially obscured by a lock of hair. "We need to see a doctor. This can't continue." "You didn't want to before," she reminded him gently. "Now it doesn't matter," he rasped, his voice laden with anguish and resignation. "I can't trust myself anymore, and I'm scared for you. I don't know what I'm capable of now." "You've never hurt me. I don't believe you would," Megan asserted, her voice firm. "Are you scared of me?" Robert caught her gaze in the mirror. "Not really," Megan replied, her voice wavering slightly. "I see how you look at me." He touched the dried blood on his forehead. "Sweetheart, I don't want anything bad to happen to you. Do you want to leave me?" Megan reached for him instinctively, grasping his shoulders and pulling him close. "After everything we've been through." But the decision was made. Once Robert agreed to see a doctor, Megan felt a weight lift slightly, hopeful that the nightmare that had haunted her might finally end. That night it did end, and a new day began. Megan fell asleep with Robert in her arms, and when she awoke, the house was eerily quiet. Robert was gone. He wasn't in any of the rooms, not in the garden, not in the garage. The car was missing too. Frowning, Megan began to call him. He answered just as her patience was wearing thin. "I'm listening." His voice was normal, as if nothing had happened. "Where are you?" "I'm at the store doing some shopping," he replied casually. "But we were supposed to go to the doctor today." I changed my mind, Robert declared abruptly, his tone clipped and decisive. What? But you... Megan began, her voice trailing off in confusion and dismay. It's my life, and I want to live it my way. Right now, I want to have some fun. Megan couldn't see his face, but the smirk in his voice was unmistakable. And what else? Speaking was difficult. Megan struggled to mask her true feelings. This wasn't the Robert she knew. He was someone else, changed inexplicably. But why? The night had already passed. She persisted, her voice soft yet probing. What do you want? First, I'm getting rid of these clothes, he said, his tone casual yet firm. After that, I'll see. The world is vast, and there are so many places I haven't explored yet. What are you saying? I don't understand. Megan's voice quivered as she fought against the rising wave of hysteria. It's nothing important, Megan. Robert's voice was low and soothing, yet it sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. But I could take you with me. I bet you've never really experienced what the world has to offer. Overwhelmed, Megan fell silent. She couldn't fathom why Robert had changed so drastically overnight. Megan, my patience has limits. You can say no, he stated, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. I'll go with you, Megan replied quickly, her decision tinged with a realization that she might be sealing her fate. Shortly thereafter, they sped off in the car. The speed was furious, the music loud, and Robert's laughter wild and joyous, filling the car and mixing with the rushing wind, leaving Megan breathless with a mixture of exhilaration and terror. She watched the blur of the road, occasionally closing her eyes, then stealing glances at Robert. He was almost unrecognizable now. The scars on his forehead had vanished, and there was no trace of the previous night's horrors. His lips seemed fuller, his cheekbones more defined. He was more handsome and yet somehow more distant. Megan watched him, marveling at how deeply she loved him yet how frightened she was of him. Robert weaved through traffic with reckless abandon, clearly relishing the adrenaline and the closeness to danger. It seemed he feared nothing anymore. They arrived at a nightclub located on the outskirts of the city, nestled among abandoned warehouses. Drunk patrons milled about, their slurred voices and clumsy movements creating a chaotic atmosphere. Robert took Megan's hand with authority, and they approached the dimly lit entrance. Then she saw it again. The symbol, an inverted cross with fangs, just like the one she had seen at Greenfield Park. The symbol was emblazoned on the wall next to the nightclub's door. A cold fear seized Megan, and she let go of Robert's hand. He looked at her with disdain. "Do you want to leave? To leave me here alone?" he asked, his voice cold and challenging. "No, I'm just surprised. It's an unusual place for a club," Megan whispered, her voice barely audible as she surveyed her surroundings, the dim lights casting long shadows that twisted and turned like the patrons themselves. "You haven't seen anything yet," Robert smirked, pushing her forward. Inside the club, the semi-darkness was pierced by flickering neon lights that cast eerie shadows on the faces of the club-goers. The music thrummed through the air, its beat almost synchronizing with the pulsing of the crowd's collective heartbeat. The scent of cheap perfume mingled with the electric excitement of the night. Robert and Megan made their way through the throng to the bar, where he ordered cocktails for both of them. Shortly after, Robert excused himself, leaving Megan alone amidst the bustling crowd. She scanned the room, its occupants varied and some with appearances that bordered on the non-human. Despite trying to locate Robert, he had already vanished from sight. In the crowded space, Megan felt an intense gaze upon her. Turning towards it, she noticed a man with a lean face, untouched by the sun, dark eyes and black hair, a scar marking his temple. His stare was unsettling. Just as she decided to search for Robert, he reappeared. "Come with me. I'll show you what a real night is like," he said, his smile both inviting and enigmatic. Megan followed him, flanked by two strangers who escorted them through the club, past the kitchen, and out a staff exit into a dark alley. The strangers walked away, leaving Megan and Robert alone in the dimly lit alley. "Why are we here?" Megan asked, her voice tinged with fear. "Hush. You'll see everything soon. Just be patient," Robert replied, cutting her off. Suddenly, two inebriated men stumbled into the alley. "Look who we have here," one slurred, his voice nasally. "Hey, girl. She's cute. Will you be mine?" jeered the other. Robert smiled and took a step towards them, seemingly oblivious to the danger they posed. Megan, watching nervously, licked her lips in anticipation. "Back off, or you'll regret it," one of the drunk men started, but was abruptly cut off. In an instant, Robert vanished, and the alley was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then the sounds of rustling and scuffling filled the air, like hundreds of wings fluttering. Megan, recoiling and pressing against the cold alley wall, squinted hard, trying to discern any distinct sounds amidst the chaos. Then a cold sensation tickled her cheek. She flinched, and suddenly the alley was filled with pained screams. These were soon followed by a wolf's piercing howl that then faded away. The rustling ceased, and a heavy silence fell. Megan, heart pounding loudly, feared moving from the wall. She waved her hand in front of her face, a futile, nervous gesture. "Robert?" she whispered into the silence, desperate for a response. In return, the roar of a beast echoed, followed by mad, triumphant laughter. Then light flashed. Megan shut her eyes briefly, then cautiously reopened them. The scene before her was gruesome, bodies torn apart, and there stood Robert, transformed into a beast. Terrified, she ran. She ran without thought, not looking back, until she burst onto a road, nearly running in front of a car that screeched to a halt just in time. "Do you want to die? What's wrong with you?" the frightened driver exclaimed as he jumped out of the car and ran over to Megan. The girl exhaled deeply, her legs trembling as she made her way back to the sidewalk. Ignoring the curious glances of passers-by, she collapsed onto the steps of a closed shop. The horror of what she had seen replayed in her mind. Human bodies smeared across the walls. Her hands began to shake again, and overwhelmed by shock and horror, she started to cry quietly, her hands pressing against her temples, alarming a passerby. Megan's memory of how and where she spent the night was hazy. It seemed she had managed to reach a friend's place, who had let her stay over. And when the sun rose, she decided she could never go home again, because Robert was no longer there. All day she wandered the streets, frightening herself and barely noticing her surroundings. Only by evening did she start to feel slightly better. The shock was subsiding, the fear was dulling, or perhaps she was just becoming accustomed to it. Thoughts of Robert gradually began to creep back into her mind. Megan was no longer certain that she wouldn't go home. Her heart ached, yearning to be where her beloved was. She no longer cared about the nightmare. She felt like she was going insane. She just wanted to return to Robert. Sitting in the cafe, she tried to force herself not to think about what might be waiting for her at home. "Excuse me for intruding, but I think you need help," said the same brunette stranger from the nightclub who had been watching her closely, now standing next to her. "Who are you?" Megan asked, shrugging off his concern. She disliked being followed. "You won't manage on your own with him," the stranger replied calmly, seemingly unaffected by her dismissiveness. What are you talking about? Who won't I manage with? With the one your, friend has become. Megan, no longer capable of being surprised, only gave a wry smirk. He's just gone insane. The stranger shook his head, then suddenly leaned in close, almost looming over her. Do you really believe that? What do you want? Megan asked, her voice weary. I want to help you. The dark blue eyes of the stranger gleamed intensely. I don't need help. You don't understand. If he's not stopped. Go away, Megan said hoarsely, her voice tinged with fear. I don't want to hear this nonsense anymore. You... Her phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Megan froze, her eyes fixed ahead as she answered the call. I'm listening. Megan. Robert's familiar voice struck her heart, and she let out a soft moan. Robert. Megan whispered into the phone. Megan, where are you? Robert's voice came softly, filled with distress. Before her eyes, an image formed. Her beloved huddled in a chair, biting his lip in an attempt to stifle his rising hysteria. I'm scared. I'm so scared. Robert. Megan's voice faltered, her eyes stinging with tears. I'll be there soon. Just hold on a bit. You'd better stay away from this house. Robert's pleading tone suddenly turned cold and slightly hoarse, cutting through the phone and jarring her nerves. Megan flinched and shouted back into the phone. Who are you? What do you want? It doesn't matter. They laughed on the other end. Just don't come back here, never again. Otherwise, I'll kill you. The connection cut off, and Megan slowly lowered the phone, her hand trembling. Who? Was that him? The stranger from earlier, whom Megan had nearly forgotten, reached out to her, but she pushed him away and bolted out of the cafe. She ran past the houses, her mind racing. To hell with everything. Robert is there. Her beloved. He's there. Megan heard him, felt him. He's there, waiting for her. She arrived at her house. The streetlights were off, casting the street into darkness, as if life itself had receded. Even the sound of a taxi's departing engine seemed distant, almost spectral. Fear gripped her, causing her body to tremble, but perhaps she was just tired of being scared. Megan climbed the steps to the porch, pushed open the door, which was strangely unlocked, and entered. Robert? She called out, navigating by memory and touch, pausing at the threshold of the living room, listening to the oppressive silence. Oddly, she hadn't been here for just over a day, but it felt like an eternity had passed. She stood there for a long moment, holding her breath and straining her eyes in the darkness. Then a gust of wind swept through the house, and suddenly hundreds of candles lit up around her. They were everywhere there was space to stand. It was strange she hadn't noticed them when she entered, but in such darkness. I told you not to come here. Robert's voice, both familiar and alien, echoed around her, and Megan shook her head. Where are you? Who exactly do you need? Robert? The voice coiled around her, both chilling and caressing. Megan no longer heard any hoarseness in it. It was the voice of her beloved, but altered, deeper, fuller, commanding. Yes, Megan breathed out, her voice barely audible. I won't leave without him. You lovebirds are so amusing. Where is he? He's not here. The candle flames flickered. Megan blinked, and when her eyes opened, Robert was standing before her. His gray eyes, with pulsating pupils, looked at her with interest and a mocking sneer. Megan stared back for a long moment, then sighed hopelessly. Robert. The essence of his spirit, her love, faintly glowed in the depths of his eyes. It was barely perceptible, but Megan knew it, saw it, felt it. Robert. Megan reached out to the figure before her. With a startled cry, she withdrew her hand as it grazed elongated claws. "Don't you dare touch me," Robert's voice came, his pupils dilating until the whites of his eyes were engulfed in darkness. Megan recoiled, inhaling sharply through clenched teeth. Lines formed on his once smooth, pale forehead, tracing a sinister pattern she remembered from that horrific night. "Who are you?" "A demon wolf," a voice from behind made Megan spin around. Dark blue eyes met hers, and her heart skipped a beat. It was the same brunette stranger from the nightclub. Suddenly, everything around her seemed to whirl out of control. A shadow darted forward, brushed against her, and threw her aside. Megan collided with something, but the adrenaline numbed any pain. Clanging, growling, and screams filled the air. The candle flames flared up, reaching toward the ceiling before dwindling into near nothingness. Shadows darted across the walls, and a howl split the air. Then silence fell. Megan shivered as a rough, uneven breath brushed against her in the darkness. She felt on the verge of shattering, unable to endure another moment of this nightmare. Then a faint glimmer appeared. It trembled weakly, but to Megan, it was a beacon of hope. It flickered away, and moments later, the room brightened slightly as the candles reignited, each new flame intensifying her relief, yet reminding her of the terror she'd endured. Covering her face with her hands, she tried to steady her shaking and control her sobs. "Hey, are you okay?" A heavy hand rested on her shoulder, and Megan reluctantly lowered her hands. She turned to see the stranger squatting in front of her, his gaze fixed on a body entwined with chains on the floor. "Robert." Her voice faltered, but she was beyond caring. The stranger exhaled in relief and turned as well. "I'm lucky he hasn't regained his full strength yet. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to subdue him." "Who are you?" Megan's mind cleared as she began to grasp the situation. "An exorcist," the stranger shrugged, standing up and pulling her to her feet. "Get up. We don't have much time." "For what?" Megan frowned, a mix of confusion and exhaustion clouding her thoughts. The stranger's look was one of regret as he stepped back. "Sit down. I'll deal with the demon wolf for now. Do you have a basement?" Megan nodded automatically, watching as the stranger kneeling slid his hands under Robert. The chains rattled, snapping her back to the moment. "Stop. What's wrong with him?" "Unconscious for now. He needs to be restrained. Otherwise, we're all in danger," he said, lifting Robert with ease and heading for the door. "By the way, my name is Brad." As Megan watched Brad maneuver through the doorway, she walked over to a chair in the kitchen and sat down. For a few moments she stared blankly into space, then rested her forehead on her hands on the table. Images flickered before her eyes. Robert's voice still echoed in her ears. Inside, though, there was emptiness, and a surreal calm. Fear had vanished. So had astonishment, disbelief, and confusion. Only a cold curiosity remained, blending with a surreal feeling. Perhaps that was why, when Brad appeared at the kitchen doorway, Megan simply looked up with a blank expression and said, "I'm ready to listen." Brad, with a wry smile, sat down across from her. After a moment of heavy silence, he asked, "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What's wrong with Robert, where you came from, and what's happening in general?" "Really everything," Brad sighed. "I'm not in a rush. Your beloved is possessed. Do you understand what that means?" "I do. Demons, rituals, exorcisms. But that's stuff for horror movies." Megan internally scrambled for a rational explanation to dismiss the nightmarish thoughts. "You need to understand that werewolves are demonic beings, resembling beasts with claws and fangs. We often think of them as just tales of humans transforming into wolves, but..." How did this happen? Megan cut him off. In the park. Brad paused briefly. That's where it happened to him. Megan tensed up, a muffled groan escaping her as she pressed her temples, memories flooding back. Fragmented words, sensations, people. All dressed in black, faces hidden, fire all around. A stone altar, and on it, Robert, trembling, helpless. Pain shot through her hands as she tried to reach him, but she was restrained. A shadow, dark and terrifying, swirling around Robert. The wind howled as the shadow drew nearer, thickening, reaching for him. It touched his lips, and Robert screamed, convulsing. They restrained him while Megan moaned, cried, and pleaded. The shadow flowed into his mouth like a thin stream, blackening his lips. Then darkness. Megan lifted her head, breathing heavily. What was that? What you had forgotten. Brad exhaled deeply. Originally, another was meant to be the vessel for the werewolf spirit. He volunteered, so I watched over him. I don't know what went wrong, but he ended up killing himself. I thought we were safe, but it was premature. They found another victim, or rather, she walked right into their hands. And now? Now? Brad's expression hardened. I was supposed to perform the ritual that same day, before the demon could strengthen in your friend. But his followers began to hunt me, and I had other concerns. Now it's too late. Robert is lost, so he must be killed. I can't let you kill him, Megan stated calmly, rising to her feet, relieved to feel steady on her legs. As long as there's even a spark of Robert's soul in him, you won't touch him. Are you certain that he still has a soul? Yes, I can feel it. Brad pondered. Then, after a few minutes, he reluctantly agreed. I'll regret this, but let's try to bring your beloved back. They paused at the top of the stairs leading down to the basement. Megan hesitated, thinking about her fear, while Brad waited patiently. After taking a few deep breaths, Megan flipped the switch. The door below was outlined in light. Slowly, giving herself time to think it over, she carefully made her way down, careful not to trip. With each step, her heart pounded harder. The door swung open quietly with a gentle push, and Megan stepped inside. Come to visit an old friend? A horrific creature covered in thick fur, a werewolf, a demon, stood before her. It waved its hand, causing the chain attached to a ring in the wall to jingle. Come to exorcise me? How foolish! I'm older, much older than your God. Your prayers, crosses, and holy water mean nothing to me. A surprise awaits your exorcist. Don't listen to him, Megan, he's deceiving you. That's what they do, Brad cut in. But you're in chains, Megan noted, surprisingly fearless. Even the black, pupilless eyes no longer scared her. It won't last. The spell's effectiveness is diminishing, the werewolf informed her politely. What do you want? Who are you? Robert, the creature said with a twisted smirk. Don't you dare speak his name, Megan snapped, her anger flaring. Here we go again. I enjoy this, the demon laughed. Megan, stay here. You're his link to the human world, Brad said, as he began sprinkling a circle of silver dust around the chained Robert. The powder shimmered as Brad started chanting arcane words, filling the air with a heavy sense of purification. The werewolf struggled, the chains clanging loudly. Foolish, this is foolish. This body is mine now. I'll tear you apart, exorcist, the demon growled. Brad continued his chant, then took a handful of silver dust, took a deep breath, and blew it forcefully towards the werewolf, dispersing it into the air. The demon convulsed violently. When it looked up again, its eyes were hollow. It looked at Megan. Darling, it hurts. I'm scared. Stop this. Help me. Don't look into his eyes, Megan. Demons prey on your soul at your weakest." Brad's voice was soft, yet each word seemed to pierce the darkness. "You can't stop me," the werewolf roared, and suddenly the basement was plunged into absolute darkness. "Megan, don't move!" Brad shouted, his voice echoing as he continued to recite the prayer in an unknown language. Megan heard a cacophony of sounds, howling, the flapping of wings, growling, and chaotic noise. A wave of heat washed over her, swiftly replaced by an unbearable chill. Robert's pleading voice echoed in her ears, mingled with curses and voices speaking in hundreds of different languages. She felt as if she were plummeting into a bottomless abyss, her consciousness fading. Suddenly, a touch on her hand and a bitter taste in her mouth snapped her back to reality. Opening her eyes, she saw Brad in front of her. "Don't get up. You're tired. Everything is fine," Brad said, sitting beside her as she lay on the floor. "What happened?" she asked weakly. Brad didn't reply directly. Instead, he pointed to Robert, who was also lying on the floor, now back in human form. "We did it, though I'm not entirely sure how stable it is. I'll keep an eye on you, and if something goes wrong, I'll come back to finish what we started," Brad declared, rising and walking towards the basement exit. Before stepping over the threshold, he turned back and added, "You're strong." Then the exorcist left. Megan struggled to her feet and, swaying slightly, approached Robert. She sat down next to him and began to stroke his head. After a while, Robert's eyes fluttered open and he looked at her. "Good morning, my sweetheart. It seems I've been asleep for too long." Ted entered the house with hopes of finally seeking refuge from the unbearable street heat within the cool walls. He promptly made his way to the kitchen, swung open the refrigerator, and fetched a life-saving cold soda. Leaving his bag of thick notebooks with play scripts upstairs in his room, he wiped away the beads of sweat from his glistening forehead and descended the stairs, traversing the corridor into the wide, spacious hall, and flopped onto the couch, taking a sip of the cool, fizzing, almost magical drink. He reminisced about his plans, anticipating the unforgettable weekend ahead after a grueling week at the theater club, rehearsals upon rehearsals. He was tired of reciting monologues repeatedly. Glancing at the wall clock, it read 4 in the afternoon. Mom would be back from work soon. Dad wouldn't be home until late in the evening. For 2 whole months now, the unrelenting heat had tormented the residents of the small town. Summer had arrived earlier than expected this year, and if you discounted the almost 1.5 months until its logical conclusion, you could confidently declare it a success. The Fletcher household, unremarkable and no better or worse than the rest, nestled away from the bustling city center with its high-rise buildings, was situated on the southwest outskirts of town. A convenient spot in close proximity to nature and removed from the pulsating central hubs, prone to boiling over with inevitable incidents. Ted lived with his parents and had yet to contemplate separating, despite his almost adult age. He was turning 18. He hadn't seriously thought about needing a girlfriend and living a separate life soon. No. He enjoyed being free, leading a carefree, naive lifestyle, not demanding much from it. Since school, Ted had adored computer games and browsing the internet for interesting, engaging youth websites. He preferred entertaining and educational TV quizzes, where participants with high erudition were challenged with complex questions and elaborate answers. Right now, after the theater club, seeking refuge from the heat, inhaling freedom deeply, he caught the latest episode of his favorite show by turning on the television and flicking through channels. His mood lifted even more. "Mom, my friends and I from the club decided to spend the weekend out in nature." "How are your stage performances going?" Mrs. Susan's tired face, outlined with business-like features after a day's work, appeared. "Yeah, I'm not bad. We have a big premiere next week. You'll come, won't you, Mom?" "How could I miss that? And of course go. Have fun with your friends." "Maybe Dad will lend me the car?" "I'll talk to him," Susan encouraged. Ted beamed with a broad smile, approached his mother, and bestowed a grateful kiss on her cheek. "Just make sure it's without any adventures," she tenderly murmured. "Oh, by the way, where are you all going?" "To the river, probably," Ted said. His mother looked at him. Her eyes, on her slender face peeking out from under not very long, thick black hair, immediately filled with seriousness. She stepped away from the stove, where she was preparing dinner, wiped her hands on her apron, took today's newspaper from the sideboard and handed it to her son. Watching his mother's movements, Ted moved his eyebrows in surprise. On the first page, under the heading Riverside Observer, he read, moving his eyes quickly over the large highlighted text. Then he turned his gaze back to his mother. "It's better to have a picnic somewhere else," Susan cautioned conclusively. "Oh, come on, Mom." Ted returned to his previous mood. "It's all fairy tales, yellow press fantasy. Mrs. Elizabeth said that park rangers advised against relaxing by the river. That cursed energy company ruined our entire ecology." "That company hasn't been around for over 3 years. It's all in the past," Ted interjected. "Mrs. Elizabeth says the river might be contaminated despite the company no longer operating and all those waste buried deep underground. And she also said that wild animals' roars can be heard at night there. Ted, my boy, maybe you'll go to another safer place." "Mom, the river skirts all the nearby forests. Where else can we go?" His smile took on a reproachful tone. "And all these newspapers will print anything to make more money. Mrs. Elizabeth talks a lot. I'm not sure her words can be trusted." "Teddy," Mom exclaimed. "Don't forget she's my close friend, and for God's sake be careful." Susan's voice rose slightly. Ted turned back to the newspaper, eyebrows furrowed. After a pause, he spoke again with the same sarcastic smile. "I'll be careful." How many times does a person need to get burned before stepping onto the right, correct path, which, being the only one, will lead to the fulfillment of all the hidden desires in the subconscious? Dreams that, splashing out and skillfully intertwining with reality, make the heart race pleasantly and rejoice in everything around. Sometimes, to achieve a certain desired goal, one needs to spend half a lifetime, or even a whole life. It happens that fate is incredibly benevolent to you and allows you to get what you've been searching for so long right away. But then there are these so-called changes, when at a certain moment a person closes their eyes to their future, and the futurist living within gives way to an involuntary realist. So what of all this can be classified as normal, an object of sane views and morals? The first, the second, the third, or maybe all options at once. Everyone thinks and reasons in their own way, choosing just one thing. But invariably, at the same time, driving through the creaky, grinding gears of the mind all other milestones. In Ted's mind, the creaky mechanism was still at rest and not ready for work, the beginning of which would signify a leap into a greater life. On the night before the trip, Ted, as usual, stayed up late on his computer. Navigating the vast expanses of the global network, amidst numerous open chat windows, he accidentally clicked on a headline leading to the hot news page. Before his eyes appeared the very introduction to the article his mother had been reading. The guy irritably looked away, then sighed, and without any interest scrolled down, causing line after line, paragraph after paragraph to appear until he reached the end of the text. The article provided a complete description of the genesis, progression, and downfall of the ominous private energy company that illegally disposed of industrial waste. Scandals, lawsuits, ultimately millions in damages, and the company's closure. However, the article concealed some of the nomenclature of these very toxic substances used for recycling secondary materials and which were once stored in the institution's warehouse. Ted's attention was focused on the citizens' call not to approach the burial site, on specialists conducting a full survey of the surrounding area, and on the possible reburial of containers with hazardous contents if necessary. His reading was interrupted by a shadow flickering outside the window. He rose from the computer, walked over, leaned on the windowsill. The huge moon, peering through the branches of the trees growing near the house, silvered the merging darkness. After gazing for a while at the night landscape presented in indistinct tones, taking a gulp of pleasant, cool air, Ted closed the open window of the second floor. Police officer Eric Morgan, investigating a series of mysterious savage murders, followed the duty nurse into the hospital room of the only surviving victim and witness of the crimes. Before him, as he expected to see, lying in the bed, already conscious after undergoing surgery, was 19-year-old Amanda Foster. The man averted his gaze from the injured girl, nodded to the nurse in gratitude, and she quietly left. Eric approached the bed, sat on the nearby chair, and after a pause spoke softly. "Amanda." The girl slowly opened her eyes. Her tired, pained gaze fell on the man. "I'm from the police. How do you feel? Are you able to talk? Can you tell me what happened?" he said calmly and evenly, not taking his eyes off her. Amanda, her weakness evident from head to toe, spoke softly. "After what I tell you, they'll put me in a psychiatric clinic." "You won't be put anywhere, I promise. Everything will be fine." The man's voice sounded soft and confident. She smiled gratefully, then tears welled up in her eyes. Sobs interrupted her speech. "At first I didn't understand where it came from, but later we realized that it was him." Now calm down, dear." Eric touched her hand. "There's no need to delve into the details. Just describe the killer. His face, appearance, age. If you remember, of course." The girl looked at the man again. She collected her thoughts and slowly began her story. Upon its completion, the police officer felt an internal discomfort from the lost confidence. On that day, after lunch, Ted Fletcher, along with other actors from the theater club, pulled up in an old pickup truck to her house at the agreed-upon time. Smiling, Amanda came out onto the street, dragging along 2 backpacks, one personal and the other with shared kitchen supplies that the guys had gathered together. Ted and his friend Lucas stepped out of the car, greeted Amanda, and helped her load her belongings into the trunk along with the other bags of personal clothing for each of the trip participants. Ted gallantly opened the rear door for Amanda, and upon hearing words of gratitude, he smiled in a businesslike manner, nodding in response. Those sitting inside crowded around, welcoming the actress with joyful greetings and hugs. Ted took the wheel, started the car, and they set off on their journey. "Listen," said Lucas, settled on the front seat to the right, holding a cigarette in one hand and constantly flicking ash out the open window, and an open beer can from the glove compartment in the other. "Have you heard anything about that energy company that got shut down? I heard from my uncle that it was all just a cover. Behind the scenes, there was actually a secret laboratory." Ted glanced at him and involuntarily smiled, seeing how his companion almost choked on a hearty sip from the can when the car wheels hit the small potholes in the asphalt. Laughter erupted from the back. "You're gonna spray the windshield with your spit?" "Yeah, thanks." Lucas tossed the empty can out the window. He was the tallest in the group, and, in addition, the skinniest of them all. Added to his mood-lifting appearance was his knack for humor, a walking anecdote. His humor was resourceful for any occasion, even though he often received reprimands from the director for improvising. However, sometimes his improvisations were actually good and very witty. That's why everyone in the troupe loved him. Now he was carefully and hastily trying to wipe beer drops off his colorful short-sleeved shirt, saying, "Ted, why are you so hard on me? Am I annoying you?" "It's not me, it's the road. There are a lot of potholes ahead," the guy behind the wheel said. "Let's assume I believe you." What was I talking about? Oh yeah. This company was hiding that they were experimenting on animals in their lab. Lucas continued his story. "You're not familiar with Mrs. Elizabeth, Lucas." Ted suddenly interjected. "What? Mrs. Elizabeth, the baker's wife?" Lucas didn't understand. "No, it's not her. Just forget it. Keep telling your story. Everyone's listening to you attentively," Ted said sarcastically. "Listen, Lucas." Harry Parker's voice came from the back. "What did they dump in the river?" "That's the interesting part. My uncle said that nobody intentionally dumped anything into the river. When the company got shut down, the employees buried all the experiments, developing medicines, dead animals, all the waste, somewhere nearby, and somehow supposedly contaminated the area," Lucas clarified. "This is terrible. The river's dirty, and I'm not going to swim there. I want to warn you right away. And I won't let those cute nymphs go there either." Harry smirked arrogantly and hugged the girls sitting next to him. They giggled sympathetically. "Behave yourselves, and don't drink too much. Cops might show up, ask us to leave the place." "We'll have to go home," the driver suddenly said. "You're a pessimist, Ted," Harry blurted out. "We can always find another place. And if we can't, we'll find the optimal solution. We'll camp right on the road, but no one will ruin our weekend." The interior of the car was filled with laughter. "Great plan. I can hardly wait," Ted sarcastically replied, adjusting the rearview mirror. It was about an hour's drive from the city to the depths of the surrounding forest. None of the passengers, nor the driver, could boast of frequently putting off all business and heading into nature. And the contaminated river was well known to the residents of the nearby areas, although it didn't have a clear name and was inconspicuous and small. Ted turned onto a wide trail, occasionally traversed by other occasional visitors and tourists. It practically led to the river itself, and the guy had been here before when he went with his father. The further the car moved into the depths of the green walls, the more impressive and wild the forest corridor seemed, exuding the pleasant damp scent of summer and the refreshing coolness that saved from the heat. Soon the trail disappeared, announcing a green dead end and turning into a wide clearing. "I don't see any contaminated zone here. I've heard a lot about these places. But what I see is just a regular forest. Maybe all these warnings are just to deter poachers," Lucas asked, nervously laughing after his statement. "Either way, we've arrived," Harry mused, scanning the treetops and dense, seemingly almost impassable thickets. Ted got out of the car and surveyed the clearing. "Perfect. This is where we'll set up our tents." "Indeed, a suitable spot," he heard Lauren's voice behind him, as she linked her arm with his. "It's a shame we don't get to gather with our group like this more often." "Exactly," Ted said. At that moment, he suddenly thought that Lauren sympathized with him more than with others. And from this, his heart raced with joy. After all, even on stage, when he looked at her among other actresses, he often had the same thought, that only she could bring him happiness or unbearable sorrow. Sometimes it seemed to him that she paid more attention to other guys in the acting troupe. But, on the other hand, Lauren rarely could casually take someone's hand or hug them like this. Such behavior from her was only observed towards the closest friends of the opposite sex. Amanda and Emily, whose voices were now a little further away and occasionally dissolved into ringing laughter in response to Harry and Lucas's jokes, were much simpler than Lauren. Although in beauty and intelligence they were not inferior to her and secretly drove many actors crazy, dreaming of winning the favor of these girls. Harry Parker was about the same height as Ted, and both of them from their group liked one girl, Lauren. Parker tried in every way to present himself to the girl in the best light, courted her, gave her gifts, repeatedly invited her to the movies. But for now, she mostly maintained a neutral position. She didn't promise anything, but she didn't reject his courtship either. Harry really wanted to date her. He took care of himself. He constantly worked on his body shape, dedicated himself to sports training, and the gym was his second home, where he achieved great results. Furthermore, he often frequented hair salons, ensuring that his overgrown hair did not detract from his appearance of courage, and 100% belonging to a true athlete. Now, as he helped to retrieve everything necessary for the picnic from the car, he kept glancing at Lauren whenever he had the chance. But the girl didn't leave this attention unreciprocated, and at one beautiful moment slipped away, moving towards Ted. At that moment, Lucas lay down on the grass and began to watch the rare clouds in the sky. "How long are you planning to laze around?" Amanda addressed him. "Yeah, I'm ready to fall asleep like an ordinary medieval traveler," Lucas replied, smiling, understanding the hint. The hot day gradually gave way to a cool night, permeated with the same aroma of wild thickets and berries. The moon had already emerged in the clear sky, peeking through the treetops, and a visible array of countless stars appeared over the clearing. The campers settled around the campfire, finishing off the sandwiches they had brought with them and listening to Lucas's story. Being the livelier one among the group, he decided to scare the others before bedtime with some scary tale. And since he was a big fan of the writer Stephen King and had reread most of his works, he decided to retell one of the most memorable stories without mentioning the author's name, so as not to distract the audience. The story was called The Cat, and was about an old man who wanted to get rid of his cat. It was possessed by a demon, which at the most unexpected moment turned the animal into a werewolf and killed people, and about how this old man hired a hitman for this very cat, fearing to approach it himself. He paid a tidy sum and had the pet taken far away while it was in a dormant state and disposed of. And then this creature woke up right in the car of the astonished killer. A professional, and what atrocities it committed with him. Lucas recounted, naturally mentioning all the bloody details and embellishing, as storytellers usually do, keeping the listeners in suspense from beginning to end. Approaching the climax of the story and smiling as he noticed Amanda subtly leaning towards Harry and Lauren towards Ted, he glanced around looking for the third girl named Emily. He saw her sitting apart, finishing off the last bottle of soda. Emily returned to the campfire with a smile, apologizing for interrupting his thought. Lucas cast her a brief, smiling glance, and suddenly felt the desire to be alone with her. Her thick, light hair gathered back into a long ponytail. Her attractive appearance and slender figure spoke for themselves. And in Lucas, his feelings spoke of being overwhelmed by the copious amount of alcohol he had consumed. And after one more gulp from the can, he suddenly forgot what he had just been talking about. Licking his lips several times and scratching his nose, he guiltily asked, "What was I talking about? Oh yeah, the cat." Leaving the torn body of the man by the car that veered into the ditch, this creature swiftly disappeared into the field, as if it had some unfinished business. That's all. He tactfully shrugged. Harry and Ted laughed. Lucas smiled at first, then burst out laughing himself. "How can anyone read such things?" Amanda suddenly asked seriously. In a second or two, the unamused expression vanished from the faces of the other girls, and the atmosphere of merriment bubbled up again in each one. Only Amanda remained pensive about something. "Well, in that case, I'll tell you another short story. About a gangster," Lucas said, symbolically pulling out a miniature silver revolver from his belt, the kind that fits into any purse pocket and is convenient for self-defense. "In the hospital." "Is that the revolver?" The policeman pulled the weapon, enclosed in a transparent bag, out of his pocket. "Yes," Amanda said. Her gaze was full of fear. At the first glance at the gun, reflecting glints of fire, Ted flinched at the thought that it was loaded with live ammunition, and the drunk Lucas waved it around carelessly while telling the story. "Lucas, where did you get it from?" "Borrowed it from my uncle?" "Are you out of your mind? What if we get caught by the police?" Ted continued. Lucas wanted to say something, but instead, a shot rang out into the ground, startling everyone. "What are you doing, you idiot? Give it to me!" Ted rushed towards him. "Are you going to shoot us all here?" The drunk Lucas started yelling something, reducing everything that had happened to just a prank. But Ted was determined to stand his ground and take the dangerous toy away from his friend. A brief struggle ensued, during which another shot rang out, making the frightened girls shriek. Suddenly a roar came from the forest thicket. A dead silence fell over the clearing. Everyone froze and stared into the darkness from where the sound was coming. At that moment, Ted, taking advantage of the situation, quickly took the gun from Lucas and gave him a stern look. No one expected that the next moment a dark creature would emerge from behind the trees and attack the armed guy. The beast literally knocked Ted to the ground. Another shot rang out. The creature bit into the guy's neck and just as quickly as it appeared, disappeared behind the trees. Everything happened so fast that for some time no one could understand exactly what had happened. Only when Lucas, staring in horror at his motionless friend, rushed to him with a cry of terror, did Harry jump off the ground and also run towards Ted. Turning him onto his back, they saw a lot of blood on his neck. The guy was dead. What? How did this happen? Oh my God, what just happened? Parker yelled in disbelief at the trembling Lucas, who seemed about to lose consciousness any moment. Sometime later, Harry continued to hold and comfort the shocked, tearful Amanda and Emily. Lauren sat by one of the tents, sobbing, covering her face with her palms. It all happened so fast. Lucas quietly repeated, sitting by the campfire, leaning his hands on his knees and rocking back and forth. "What will happen to us? What now? We need to leave, and as soon as possible." Harry abruptly interrupted his whimpering. Lucas nodded and, frowning, closed his eyes. "We need to get Ted's body into the car now, take him home, and tell his parents everything." Lauren's indifferent voice came from afar. "It's the only right decision." "You're out of your mind!" Lucas yelled. "They'll kill us! I brought the weapon here, and if they find out, do you think Ted's parents will believe us that a beast attacked their son? They'll... What do you suggest?" Harry reproached him. We need to leave the body here. Or better yet, throw it in the river, along with the weapon, and then report Ted missing to the police." Upon hearing this, Harry flew into a rage and lunged at him, pushing him onto his back and holding a clenched fist over him. Emily rushed after him. "Harry, stop it, please. Fighting won't solve anything right now. Please stop. Please," she begged, shaking him by the shoulders from behind. He looked disdainfully into Lucas's eyes, still keeping his fist ready. In those very eyes of the once joker and life of the party, who had recently entertained his friends by the campfire with tall tales, now read fear, despair, and weakness. And when tears involuntarily rolled down those eyes, Harry's anger subsided slightly, and he let go of his friend, though still pushing him away with some disgust. "We'll take Ted home and then we'll see what happens next." "No, Lucas is right. We can't just ruin our entire future with one move." "No one will believe us," Emily said. Harry, Lauren, and Amanda stared at her. "We don't even know what will happen. His parents, our own parents, court, jail. We need to simplify everything. Ted won't come back. His life was cut short, but we still have our lives. And while we're discussing this here, we don't know when that beast will attack again, and we're wasting our time." Her words pierced the foggy consciousness of everyone present like a needle. They all, of course, realized that they might not be believed, and that if after the investigation they find bullet casings or the revolver, they might be taken for murderers. The decision was made, and it was simply explained by the primary instinct of self-preservation. At that moment, every member of the group, who set off on what turned into a nightmare vacation, forgot about everything else in the world. About everything, except for this most primal instinct. They decided not to think about what awaited them tomorrow, in a month, a year, 5 years, and even for a while forgot that somewhere nearby, the beast was lurking. When Harry and Lucas dragged Ted's body to the river, they noticed something new, adding fuel to the already burning fire of their criminal thoughts. A police car stood half in the water, half on the shore. The windshield was covered in a web of fine cracks, formed by powerful blows. The side windows were completely smashed. "What's going on here?" Lucas's voice oozed with fear. "I don't know. But I don't think the police, who left the vehicle here, are hanging around nearby," Harry replied. Sometime later, they returned to the parking spot. "They dumped the body in the river?" The policeman sitting next to Amanda in the hospital clarified. "Yes," the girl replied. "Continue with what happened next," Eric requested. Emily, Amanda, Lauren, Lucas, Harry, they all looked at each other, still disbelieving what had happened with their eyes. "What now?" Amanda asked listlessly. "Now we need to go to the town and report his disappearance to the police, of course, concocting a convincing story that we saw a wild beast," Lucas declared categorically. "And not a word about the weapon." Emily shook her head. Harry approached Amanda and hugged her. Nestling into his chest, she burst into tears again. "We'd better get out of here now. We've lingered for too long." Emily summed up everything. And so they did. In the darkness of the night, they began to pack up their tents and other belongings. Although they had decided to head back, they couldn't force themselves to leave the forest. Their conscience gnawed at them from within, eating away at their hearts and souls. Moreover, they discussed the smashed police car by the river. What was really going on here? Could the police, even if injured in a confrontation with potential enemies, simply abandon their service vehicle like that? Perhaps there was another explanation. Criminals dealt with the law enforcement officers, hid their bodies somewhere, and abandoned the car in the bushes. But in that case, this place would now be swarming with search teams looking for their colleagues. In general, the comprehensive answer to all questions now amounted to zero. And the 5 travelers finally decided to get out of here as far as possible. Tormented by various thoughts that wouldn't let her go, Lauren, with sadness in her eyes and heart, numbly watched her friends gathering their belongings into the car. Why did it have to happen to her? The event that tore her apart from the inside, causing her heart to break into pieces. She took a step, then another towards the camp, when suddenly she thought she heard some movement in the depths of the thickets. She stopped, listened. No, it wasn't hallucinations. She distinctly heard someone approaching, rustling through the dry stems of wild plants and branches. Again, that dark beast. But then the rustling stopped, as if teasing her. No, it wasn't a beast. It would have attacked her. It was someone else. She quickly headed towards the car, where the others were standing ready to leave, and grabbed a flashlight from inside. "What are you doing?" Harry asked. "I'll be right back," Lauren replied, and headed towards the thicket, towards which the car's headlights were directed. She moved along a narrow, barely visible path through the thickets, which the guys used to go to the river. She aimed the flashlight in different directions, hoping to illuminate the wounded police officer. Unlike her friends, whom she now considered former friends, Lauren wanted everyone to know what had happened, and she wasn't going to hide the events of this night from the police. However, she couldn't say it to the others. Otherwise, she might also end up in the river. Emily was ready to do anything for that idiot Lucas. She decided to find the policeman who might have been nearby. A couple of times Lauren even called out. But the response was an exhausting silence, interrupted only by the distant, indistinct voices of the young people near the car. Unnoticed by herself, the girl walked down to the river. The police car was exactly where the guys described it, but there was no one around. The quiet murmuring of the running water in the darkness was the only thing present here now. Although, no. Lauren, startled, heard someone's heavy, deep breathing to her right. The beam of the flashlight reflected in someone's gigantic, wild eyes. A strong, clawed paw strike. Lauren's blood gushing from her torn throat. "Where is she?" Harry exclaimed nervously. "I'll go after her," Lucas said, climbing out of the car. As soon as he approached the grove, something leaped out at him from the bushes. Seeing this, Harry sprang out of the car, but then stopped when he realized that his friend was beyond saving. And the indescribably terrifying creature, clenching its blood-stained, unnaturally long fangs, mesmerizingly stared at the guy. The latter recoiled, back into the cabin, slammed the door, and, amid the screams of the shocked girls once again, started the car abruptly, turned it around with the same zeal, chased it down the trail back to the main highway. "What? What was that?" Emily exclaimed in hysteria. "I don't know. But it's definitely not an animal. It's something worse, and we need to get out of here." "As far away as possible," Harry nervously replied. "And where did you go? Home?" The policeman broke the long pause. "Yeah, home to Ted's." Harry decided on the road to change the plan, and that it was better to blame it on Lucas and the creature in the woods, although Emily was against it. We drove to the Fletcher house and told Ted's parents about the creature, the deaths of our comrades, the weapon, and the fact that Lucas had brought it, Lauren explained. The car was parked at the house. People flickered in the illuminated windows now and then. In the darkness of the remote surroundings, beyond the reach of the blanket of light pouring from the lantern hanging under the roof of the house, it now dwelled. That same feeling of an impending burden of inevitability of some new event. The smell of fear and anxiety permeated the air here, near the house, as soon as the car pulled up. The neighboring cottages, located from different sides, whose outlines in the darkness resembled gray, towering rocks, seemed to have been deserted for a long time. As usual, people in them either had already gone to bed due to the late hour, or had left for the city for a while. In different parts of the world, sometimes unimaginable, fantastic things happen, witnessing which, a person involuntarily risks ending up in a mental institution. And right now, the story of 3 frightened young people really resembled nonsense that only a lunatic would tell. But nevertheless, David Fletcher, having made his wife sit down and calm down, instructed the young people to tell the truth as it was, no matter how absurd their story might seem. And when Harry finished, Ted's father stood up from his chair and, looking once again at all three of them, with a smile that did not hide the seriousness in his eyes, asked, "And now, the truth. What were you drinking?" "David," his wife exclaimed angrily, already through tears. "What?" he burst out in response. Then, regaining his composure, he said, "I'll call the sheriff. Let him sort it out," David declared. "Do you not believe us?" Emily asked weakly. The man gave her a stern look, and she immediately lowered her moist eyes. He grabbed his phone. He was about to dial the number of the police station, but didn't hear a dial tone. "The connection isn't working," he muttered nervously. "When will they fix that damn antenna?" Susan said, her eyes fixed on the young people, just like her husband, not believing their story. Although she realized that something had happened, right there, in the forest, by the river. Something terrible, if not worse. Maybe Teddy was really dead. She covered her face with her hands. "I'll go to the sheriff," David said, stepping outside the kitchen and opening the front door. Suddenly, a horrifying, choking scream pierced the air. Everyone rushed into the corridor and found themselves in the hall in a heartbeat. Harry's heart pounded like a machine gun when he heard women's screams again and saw ahead the monster. The same one that tore Lucas apart in the forest, and now was here, in the house, next to David Fletcher, convulsing in a pool of his own blood. It was something. Huge, insane, bulging yellow eyes burned with wild rage as they surveyed the people, choosing a new victim. The creature, covered in dense fur, vaguely resembled a human. But calling it human was difficult. What stood before the stunned onlookers was the result of an unimaginable mutation of a huge dog or wolf. The skin on the creature's body looked tough and black. Where there was no skin and fur, everything was covered in meaty, uneven lumps of dried blood and protruding tendons. The head, or rather its upper half, was gigantic in proportion to a human's. It was covered in dead, sagging skin, forming dreadful folds on the temples. Long, yellow upper and lower fangs protruded from the visible gums of its mouth like sharp spikes. The other teeth, visible in the animal's grimace, resembled thick, long needles that converged in the mouth, leaving gaps between them. The creature's paws were one continuous undulating tumor, each merging into 3 thick fingers with sharp black claws. Its legs, similar in appearance but longer and comparatively bulkier, supported all this horror. They ended in a foot with 4 huge protrusions, each adorned with equally disgusting curled claws. The creature moved like a human, on 2 hind legs. Large animal nostrils pulsed, repeatedly inhaling the air. In height, the creature exceeded an adult human. The monster, slightly hunched over, approached slowly, blinking its eyes from time to time and emitting long, blood-curdling sounds. They began with a hiss and turned into a guttural moan and roar. "What is this? Oh God, what is this?" Susan, choking back tears and clutching the girls to herself, repeated. The intruder, as if hypnotizing, shifted its gaze from one terrified, petrified face to another. At the same time, it moved its disgustingly large jaws smoothly. "Teddy!" Amanda exclaimed. "Teddy, can you hear me?" Everyone in the room stared at her in confusion. "Why did you assume it was him?" the policeman asked, squinting. "Because only now did I notice the dirty silver bracelet on the creature's right paw, which Ted never parted with. Neither at the theater club nor at home," the girl replied. "It was him. I know." Then Harry rushed back to the kitchen and, finding a huge cleaver on the table, returned. He shielded the woman, assuming a defensive stance and threatening the beast with the cold weapon, shouted, trying to hide his fear behind anger. "Don't come any closer, you monster." The monster paused. Wild, predatory fire blazed in its physiognomy. Copious saliva dripped from its fangs onto the floor. The room was increasingly filled with the acrid smell of toxins, chemicals, and decay. Susan, taking cautious steps and never taking her eyes off the distracted creature due to Harry's antics, began to retreat towards the stairs. Meanwhile, the guy, gripping the knife handle tightly in his hand and constantly wiping away the sweat stinging his eyes, had now turned into a wild, raging animal inside. He was ready to rush into battle at any moment. Finally, his patience snapped, and muttering, "Goodbye, Ted," he agilely lunged at the enemy, swinging the chopping tool. But as if anticipating his action, the beast thrust its paw forward. The cleaver fell to the floor with a metallic clang. Then immediately, Harry's head rolled across the floor, hitting the bottom wooden step right at Susan's feet, who screamed at the top of her lungs and ran up the stairs. Emily, on the other hand, without realizing her actions anymore, rushed to the door after the splatter of bloody droplets, splashing her from head to toe. "Emily, be careful! Watch out!" Amanda screamed, seeing how the creature caught up with her best friend with one giant leap and afterwards tore her apart. After about 3 minutes, which felt like hours, Amanda, standing motionless and pale as chalk, saw the creature detach itself from the mutilated body, licking its long, agile tongue over its red fangs. The gaze of its ugly, glowing, still hungry eyes, devoid of anything positive, fell on the last remaining victim. The menacing new snarl spoke of a new imminent leap that would put an end to all this bloody event. The girl stood there, unable to move or avert her gaze, pouring a doomed look at the hellspawn and already mentally bidding farewell to life. Although at that moment, she could hardly think of anything at all. The thunderous gunshot made her flinch. When she saw the creature collapse on the floor next to the deceased Emily, Amanda, now awakened from the trance, turned towards the stairs. At its base stood Susan, holding a weapon with a smoking barrel in her hands. "Die, monster," the woman murmured, pulling the trigger. The ejected bullet casing clattered to the floor. The woman slowly, step by step, as if fearing that any loud noise might revive the monster, approached Amanda and embraced her with one hand. The motionless, terrifying enemy now resembled an overturned werewolf dummy from fantasy movies. Susan released the girl from her embrace, approached the sprawled creature and delivered a final shot to its repulsive face, whose fiery eyes still stared motionless at the ceiling. Now, calmly, the woman returned to Amanda, who was still on the verge of fainting. Triumphantly, she took her by the hand and led her to the door. As soon as they stepped outside and took in a breath of fresh air, the girl, slowly but stuttering, looked at the disheveled hair and pale face of her savior and asked, "What are we going to do now?" Susan, after thinking for a moment, couldn't find anything to say, so she hugged Amanda tightly, dropping the weapon to the ground. A couple of seconds passed, and Amanda felt a lightning bolt of pain shoot through her left side, knocking her off her feet. She had no strength left to scream, and her silent cries spilled out in a new wave of warm tears. Crawling forward, grabbing the weapon, she looked back when Mrs. Susan's long scream stopped. At the door, dropping to all fours, the same unvanquished predatory beast sank its huge fangs into her flesh, tearing it apart with a crunch. Amanda gathered her last strength and began to shoot accurately, jerking the clicking bolt and pulling the trigger, straight into the vile head and torso. After a few minutes, following a powerful barrage of shots, the creature, blood spraying in all directions, disappeared into the doorway. Then inside, there was one final, almost deathly, beastly cry. Amanda gritted her teeth and, tossing the weapon aside, burst into loud sobs. Strips of bloody skin hung from her torn thigh. She lost consciousness. But before that, she heard the approaching sirens. For a couple of minutes, the girl silently looked at the police officer, indicating by this that she had finished her story and waiting for his reaction. Eric, lost in thought, averted his gaze. Then, with professional calmness, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the bracelet, and asked, "Is this it?" "Yes," the girl replied in the same weak voice. "Oh, by the way, did you find the body?" "The monster?" the policeman interrupted her. She nodded. "No," he said apologetically, staring guiltily at the silver chain in his hand. "Don't you believe me?" Her smile was more of a pleading grimace. "Rest, Amanda. You need to regain your strength." "Thank you. Rest and don't think about anything," he said, as he slowly got up from his chair and headed for the door. "Don't you believe me?" she repeated word for word, raising her voice. Eric stopped. He turned around and succinctly stated, "I believe you." He paused and repeated, nodding slightly, "I believe you." After all, we found the remains of police officers not far from their car, the same one that crashed into the river. According to our experts, they were attacked by some enraged predatory animal. It happened before you even entered the forest. But now I have a new version to consider. So everything's fine. Thanks again. He smiled and left the room. This case was never solved. Arctic, early autumn. It's been 2 hours since radio contact was lost with 2 scientists. The expedition started successfully despite the significant depth. James and Christopher were the most experienced researchers at the station, and they maintained communication via the internal system throughout the journey into the icy tunnel. Reaching the halfway point, they made a stop to adjust the pressure in their protective suits before continuing their descent to 3,000 feet, where they left the specialized transport module and began their journey along a narrow ice corridor prepared in advance. The temperature in the tunnel remained stable at 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Just a year ago, extreme colds limited research in such conditions, yielding little scientific results. However, thanks to new technologies and specially designed thermal insulated suits for scientists, researchers could now expect to maintain a comfortable body temperature in icy conditions for at least 3 hours. During their movement through the corridor, both scientists maintained a continuous dialogue via internal communication, describing the terrain and cracks in the icy surface, noting its saturated, almost magical sky blue color. And suddenly, their conversation was cut off. Before them appeared a large crack. Everything was dark, and the icy walls seemed incredibly calm. Unnatural silence enveloped them. As they approached the crevice, they heard a sound. At first, it was just a lone, eerie whistle echoing through the icy corridor. The sound, perhaps, was caused by the wind, or even some unknown natural phenomenon. The scientists began to look around for the source of the sound. One of them picked up a portable ground-penetrating radar and began to scan from side to side in hopes of detecting the source of the noise. However, they found nothing. The scientists were about to continue their journey when suddenly a loud crack sounded, and both researchers barely managed to jump back, seeing how the mirror-smooth surface of the ice in front of them cracked, widening the crevice even more. And suddenly, through the dense ice, about a dozen similar sounds rang out, surrounding them from all sides. They were louder than the first, and at that moment, darkness engulfed them. Fear became the last sensation to grip James and Christopher. Then the loud sound also suddenly ceased. Ethan Carter loved to observe the night sky. In New York, he couldn't see the stars, unlike in the Arctic, where they were not obscured by light pollution. The auroras danced in the sky, and the Milky Way shone brightly overhead. The night seemed alive and full of wonders, with islands of light suppressing the darkness of space. Could there be a more beautiful sight? In childhood, Ethan dreamed of becoming an astronaut. However, he was born not in the right place and not at the right time, so his chances were slim from the start. Instead, he became a geneticist, and climbing the career ladder, eventually became the chief scientist of the Eden Station. Instead of landing on the moon, he led a large team studying dangerous infections. The government chose the Arctic as the location for the station for several reasons. Primarily, it was done to prevent dangerous breaches of containment conditions and to study ancient viruses frozen under the ice. Some of them could devastate the Earth if released, and Ethan's superiors wanted to maintain an advantage in biological weaponry. The future was uncertain. Wars were happening regularly, such as in eastern Ukraine or in Africa or the Middle East. Some might have objected to working on weapons of mass destruction, but Ethan slept soundly at night. International relations were based on strength, and strength stemmed from technological superiority. To ensure his country's survival, he needed to outpace competitors by any means necessary. Perhaps one day his work would kill millions of people, or perhaps not. Though he preferred nuclear weapons to remain in their silos, they would come in handy if the end of the world ever arrived. Ethan was paid for the dirty work, but it was necessary work. Standing beside his special off-road vehicle, Ethan felt the cold seep into his suit. He wore warm clothing, including a parka, goggles, gloves, and a balaclava, but the Arctic was the harshest place on Earth. No one was entirely safe here, and he was miles away from the station, surrounded only by ice. But Ethan didn't mind. The sight of the night sky already warmed him. He knew that extraterrestrials existed. The samples he found in the Arctic almost convinced him that life came from space in the form of primitive viruses and bacteria. What strange and wondrous creatures inhabited the stars above his head? He hoped to live long enough to find out. Truth be told, the scientist enjoyed these quiet moments of solitude, which he couldn't find on the crowded station. Ethan didn't particularly bond with anyone, nor did he want to. Work was his life. "Tyler calling Ethan," his assistant called him over the intercom. "Ethan, come in." "I'm here," he replied, "just admiring the stars." "Oh, good. I was starting to worry. James and Christopher have stopped responding. We have problems." Who would have doubted it? Tyler was naturally anxious, and suddenly 2 lead researchers disappear while Ethan is out for a stroll. The scientist imagined his assistant panicking around the station and smiled to himself. However, carelessness could come at a high cost. So Ethan decided to return to Eden. "We're detecting anomalous electromagnetic activity in the area," Tyler said. "Probably just the auroras," Ethan replied absent-mindedly. He looked at them, and their color seemed to change from green to a light shade of red. "I'll be back soon." "Sorry, Tyler's voice was replaced by radio interference. "Ethan, what is... Tyler?" the scientist called out, his communicator glitching. "Can you hear me?" Only static was heard in response. "Tyler?" Ethan called out again, squinting. The auroras above his head grew brighter, streaks of red light illuminating the frozen wasteland. The interference turned into a buzzing, almost piercing sound. "Tyler?" Another voice answered him, but not with words, but with a beastly roar. The ground trembled beneath the scientist's feet, small cracks and fissures forming in the ice. The sky grew brighter until the night turned into a crimson day. Realizing something was amiss, Ethan immediately jumped into his car and slammed on the gas pedal. The powerful reinforced wheels tore through the snow as the scientist raced back to the Eden station. Damn, what's happening?" Ethan continued to call out over the intercom, but all he heard were strange, unintelligible sounds. "Tyler, do you see this?" Two red auroras split the sky in half. Space itself tore apart, as if the eyelids of a giant eye were opening. A black spot, expanding into a sea of red light, a black hole growing from the heart of a ghostly star. Desperately trying to get away, Ethan still peered out the window to get a better look at what was happening. Curiosity triumphed over self-preservation instinct. The black spot grew to gigantic proportions, allowing the scientist to peer inside it. Only then did he realize he was looking at the gates to the very fabric of space-time. At that moment, the ground behind the car split open, forming a hole, and a huge crack rapidly approached the scientist. "No, no, no!" Ethan drove faster than ever before, the car's engine smoking. He knew the fall was inevitable. The ground shook beneath the wheels. Because of the earthquake, the car's alarm wailed like a dying cry of agony. "What is this?" Ethan didn't finish the sentence before the hole engulfed him entirely, a stream of snow following behind the car. Ice shards scattered in all directions, shattering the reinforced windshield and throwing the SUV aside. The scientist hit his head on the safety cushion, the car flipping over a dozen times, and darkness swallowed Ethan whole. Eden Station. Tyler walked down the gloomy hallway where red light flickered, creating tension with each flash. Around him, a frantic siren sounded, announcing a state of emergency in the laboratory building. Against the backdrop of radio interference, his communicator constantly caught echoes of chaos. Noises, screams, sounds of gunfire, and desperate pleas for help. The corridor was littered with traces of disorder. Blood in some places, station workers' bodies lay. With each step Tyler took, he felt increasing disgust. Sweat dripped down his back, and fear paralyzed his movements. He tried to check every corner for survivors. Suddenly, a loud growl came from behind him. Turning around, he saw a huge creature resembling an oversized dog with impressive teeth and claws. Blood dripped from the monster's jaws, and he was wearing some sort of futuristic armor covered in slime. The scientist was stunned and frightened by this monster. Suddenly, he heard the voice of the station's security chief, Victor. "Tyler, run!" The scientist came to his senses and ran towards Victor, who had already pulled out a weapon and started shooting at the monster. The wolf-like creature dodged the bullets and ran away. Victor wasted no time and ran in the opposite direction of the monster, taking Tyler with him. On their way, they encountered twitching corpses, wounded people begging to be saved, blood and pieces of flesh. But Victor and Tyler, frightened by the whole scene, ran without stopping. "What's happening here?" the security chief asked loudly without stopping. "I was about to ask you the same thing," the frightened scientist replied. After some time, they reached a large, brightly lit room where several other people were barricading the doors. A scientist with a badge reading Herman on his chest was giving instructions. An security guard approached him and began reporting what he had seen. Herman asked him about the doors leading outside. The guard replied that they were blocked, and the control panel was on fire. The scientist started cursing loudly, convinced that someone had done it intentionally. Time passed, and cries, sobbing, growling, and other disgusting sounds could be heard from beyond the door. People began to panic, realizing they were alone with the monsters. Some scientists began to suggest their ways to escape outside, through the ventilation shafts, breaking through the ceiling, or descending into the basement. All these suggestions seemed absurd, but it was clear that people were desperate. Suddenly, one of the walls collapsed, filling the room with dust and dirt, and monsters rushed into the room through the huge hole in the wall. When Ethan regained consciousness, the car was upside down on its roof. The scientist's vision blurred as he reached for the door, and it took him several minutes to crawl out of the SUV. Snow had piled up around him, and Ethan had to dig himself out with his bare hands. A few drops of frozen water slipped inside his suit, making him shiver. When the scientist managed to stand next to his car, he wondered where the stars had gone. It took him a moment to realize the truth. A huge metal dome loomed above him. The colossal black structure, comparable in size to a human city, was partially hidden under a layer of snow. Its smooth metal surface was like a starless night, and the eye-like windows seemed to be watching the scientist. Ethan held his breath. What was this? A spaceship or an abandoned station? Although he didn't believe in any god, he had to admit that his survival was nothing short of a miracle. Quickly checking himself for injuries, Ethan immediately tried to contact his station. "Tyler, can you hear me?" No reception. The scientist cautiously stepped out of the shadow of the metal structure to look up. He hoped to see the sky through the huge crack he had fallen into. Absolute darkness prevailed, except for a few violet lightning bolts. Strange meteorological phenomena were probably interfering with communication. Ethan tried to dig out the car, but quickly realized it was hopeless. The successive blows had disabled the engine, and he had no idea how to fix it. The emergency radio also didn't work, so there was no way to contact Eden. However, emergency rations, a flashlight, a portable heater, shovels, and other basic tools remained in the trunk. He could hold out for a few days, hoping for rescue. His colleagues couldn't just leave him stranded in the Arctic, yet doubts plagued him every time he looked up. Ethan took the flashlight, checked the battery, and decided to explore the place where he had ended up. It took him several hours. The size of the black structure defied comprehension, and indeed, it was impossible to tell how much more was buried under tons of ice. A cursory analysis revealed that it was made of strange metals that Ethan couldn't identify. Eventually, the scientist found an entrance, namely a crack in the structure, partially buried in snow. But it was large enough for Ethan with some effort to squeeze through. He almost tried his luck before deciding that going alone was too dangerous. He needed to contact Station Eden, his team, the military. They had to know. Everyone had to know that aliens existed. For no other reason would this structure be here. This black, perfectly smooth, metallic ship or station was of extraterrestrial origin, and that changed everything. It was the greatest event in human history since the discovery of fire. It would forever change the fate of the world. Ethan would live long enough to see humanity enter a new era of development using this discovery. Maybe they could even make contact with a highly advanced civilization, clearly capable of interstellar travel. National rivalries in the light of such an event now seemed insignificant. Humanity was not the only intelligent species among the stars, and internal disagreements no longer mattered. If the aliens were willing to share their technology, then no one would fight over resources anymore. Perhaps this discovery would contribute to global peace, to the creation of a unified human government that would no longer need biological weapons. For a moment, Ethan dreamed of a world that would no longer need weapons of mass destruction. But for now, he needed to somehow contact the station. He had to get out of this huge crevice. Ethan decided to walk. Maybe he wouldn't be able to get out of the pit. but at least he could go far enough to see the stars and orient himself by them, or find a place with better communication. His flashlight was adapted to the Arctic cold, but it didn't have unlimited energy. The scientist walked for 2 hours in one direction and found himself back at the dome. He walked left and right, north and south, but every time he returned to the starting point. Ethan always ended up back at the metallic structure. In the end, the scientist had to accept the bizarre truth. Somehow space had folded, forming an infinite loop. The outside world was closed to him, perhaps as a defensive measure by this alien contraption. It was no wonder he couldn't get a good signal. Unfortunately, this completely shattered his hopes of a quick rescue. There was only one place left to go. Summoning his courage, the man approached the crack in the structure and inspected it. Shining his light into the gap, the scientist could see little. However, the hole was large enough for him to, with some effort, squeeze inside. "Is anyone there?" Ethan called out. "Hey, anyone?" It was foolish, and the scientist knew it. It was unknown how long this structure had lain beneath the ice, and it was unlikely that any living creatures remained here. Still, it was worth a try. After all, who knows? Maybe the aliens somehow managed to survive. But there was no response. Gaining courage, the man reached his hands into the crack and slowly squeezed inside, holding the flashlight forward. Slipping out on the other side, Ethan found himself in a place that must have been something like a corridor or an airlock. He saw what looked like doors, and they were ominously torn apart, with icy dust floating in the room. The light from the flashlight illuminated strange patches of green slime on the walls, which Ethan avoided touching. Perhaps it was some unknown biological plant. At least he could breathe. Air from outside penetrated into the structure. It was cold here, but not nearly as intense as in the Arctic wasteland. The scientist passed through the next set of doors and entered a network of vast metal corridors. Red crystals embedded in the ceiling provided light, but half of them were shattered. Sometimes Ethan walked for more than 20 minutes in one direction, lighting his way only with the flashlight. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous structure, making him nervous. The ceiling was high, at least 26 feet. The walls were made of the same black metal as the rest of the ship, so smooth that Ethan couldn't find any signs of welding or riveting. Occasionally, he came across strange, nondescript doors, each of different sizes. Obviously, the structure was designed to accommodate beings of various sizes, but Ethan found neither a biometric lock nor a computer system. Attempts to open the doors with his bare hands led nowhere. "Hey?" The man's voice echoed through the empty corridors, but there was only silence in response. "Is anyone there?" What happened in this place? He didn't have to wait long to find out. After a long, solitary walk, he finally found open doors, or rather torn apart. The first room he entered was, in Ethan's opinion, something like a hangar, and it was as huge as an airport. But the most surprising thing was that the hangar accommodated a dozen vehicles the size of commercial airliners. They were alien craft, flat triangles with advanced reactors that reminded Ethan of stealth bombers. All of them showed signs of damage, and a strange symbol was engraved on their hulls. And the smell. A nauseating stench filled the air, making him feel sick. "Is anyone here?" Ethan asked, scanning the surroundings with his flashlight. Very few red crystals continued to emit light, so he could hardly see anything. "Is anyone—" At that moment, he directed the flashlight at the body of an animal. Startled, the scientist took a step back and covered his mouth to stifle a scream. The flashlight flickered, revealing another gigantic figure in the darkness. Its innards and strange organs spilled out of its abdomen. Holding his breath, the man aimed the light at the floor to get a better look at it. Bodies. There were bodies everywhere. To his horror, Ethan had stepped into an open grave. It was a slaughterhouse. One didn't have to be a detective to understand that a battle had taken place here, and the aliens had killed each other by the dozens, if not hundreds. They all wore strange, futuristic armor made of incomprehensible slime, and various organic weapons integrated into their hands. However, the creatures were of different sizes and shapes. Some were reptilian humanoids slightly taller than humans, others resembled wolves or werewolf-like monsters. Opposite them lay piles of red metal scrap and broken biobots. The machines had legs and arms like humanoids, as well as sharp claws. Damn. What the hell happened here? Ethan exhaled, surveying the corpses. Symbols were engraved on the slimy armor of all the aliens. Judging by the arrangement of the bodies, it seemed they had fought each other to the last being. Then Ethan inspected the hangar walls and discovered that they had been pierced through by some metal cones. Hatches on their noses were opened, full of robots, most of which had been torn to pieces. It didn't take Ethan long to understand what had happened. The robots breached this metallic structure, ramming through its outer defenses with their small vessels. The inhabitants of this place put up fierce resistance, but were overwhelmed due to the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy, allowing the attackers to penetrate the corridors and spread throughout the structure. Ethan held his breath, trying to calm himself. What nightmare had he stumbled into? The scientist examined the bodies in case any of them, he himself didn't know. Pretending to be dead? Just wounded? His hopes quickly faded. The victorious side mercilessly finished off the wounded before moving on. However, as he made his way through the hangar, Ethan noticed a creature unlike the others. It wore futuristic orange armor like some others, but the body shape, 2 legs, 2 arms, broad shoulders, 5-fingered hands, the way it contorted near the torn door. Ethan cautiously approached the body, studying it with the flashlight. Golden patterns connected the modular parts of the armor, and from a large hole protruded a frozen heart, but with wires instead of arteries, and metallic lungs. The armor was surgically attached to the skin, just like the guns on the shoulders and arms. Nearby, the man saw a severed head on the floor. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. It was a human head. The eyes, the nose. There was no mistaking it. Shaken, Ethan continued his journey into the depths of the structure, walking among the dead. By the time he emerged from the hangar into the adjacent chambers, he could barely take a step without slipping on severed hands, decapitated bodies, and mangled remains. However, that was the least troubling moment. He entered some sort of laboratory, where countless specimens swam inside techno-organic mechanisms shaped like hearts. Cables' veins pumped containers with green liquid, keeping their inhabitants in stasis. The transparent scales allowed Ethan to examine the creatures inside. Some of them had once been humans, but they had been gutted, and their organs replaced with cybernetic implants. However, most belonged to wolf-like creatures of various sizes. One was the size of a dog embryo, another, muscle mass, fur, fangs, and 2 gray eyes. In the next container was a larger, slender specimen with 4 eyes and elongated arms. And in the container next to it, a spiky, armored monster with a wolf's head. The largest was a colossal biocybernetic beast over 8 meters tall. However, one exception stood out from the rest. Inside the container swirled a blue alien slime. When Ethan placed his hand on the alien glass that separated them, the slime extended tentacles and slammed against the wall of its prison. "Are you really alive?" Ethan whispered, stunned. "Whoever you are, I'm glad to meet you," the scientist grimly joked. The temperature in the laboratory differed. It was very warm here. There were no frozen corpses. Suddenly, a roar erupted from his left. The man immediately turned and aimed the flashlight into the dark corner of the laboratory. In the darkness crawled an alien slightly taller than him. From its right arm remained a bloody broken stump. It was covered in fur and looked like a werewolf from fairy tales. The alien emitted a mournful, painful hiss, clutching the hole in its chest. There were also holes in its legs. "My God, are you alive?" Ethan suddenly began to pray. He exhaled and asked, "Do you understand me?" The creature carefully inspected Ethan before responding with a mournful sound. Then it looked at its wounds and hissed again. It couldn't understand the human, but it was intelligent enough to establish contact. And it didn't look hostile, just desperate. Although Ethan wasn't naturally compassionate, he couldn't ignore the suffering of the creature in pain, especially an intelligent one. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I can help." The scientist cautiously approached the creature to better examine the wounds. "I have bandages in my car, but I'll have to go back." Although the alien's face showed nothing human, Ethan noticed a change in its eyes. Something cold and cruel. A gleam that instantly made him wary. Only reflexes saved the man's life. He jumped back. The monster, like a seasoned predator, quickly raised its left hand with claws and tried to grab the man. Dodging the alien's attack, Ethan stumbled and broke the container behind him. The scientist was too shaken to react when the monster tried to attack him again. The creature let out a menacing roar and crawled towards him. However, the man managed to gather himself and quickly got to his feet, backing away in horror. The alien, possibly suffering from terrible wounds, looked at him with hateful malice in its eyes. "Go to hell, you bastard," Ethan growled before kicking the alien in the wound. Unable to support its weight on the stump, the monster fell forward, hissing in pain. More blood flowed from the wound, and soon it stopped moving altogether. He tricked me, the man thought. He tried to lower my guard and kill me. He was dying but still tried to kill me. The realization shook Ethan to the core. He had always believed that alien civilizations advanced enough for interstellar travel had outgrown basic instincts, that they would be wise and peaceful. He was wrong. Every ecosystem had its predators, and he had just survived one of them. Only then did the scientist remember that he had accidentally smashed the container with the test creatures. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and saw a wave of slime crashing towards him. He tried to scream, but the slime immediately filled his throat. It engulfed the scientist entirely, starting from his head, filling his ears, merging with his skin, entering his bloodstream. It filled his cells and bone marrow, overloaded his nerves, and stuffed the man's brain with knowledge. Ethan tried to claw his eyes out, feeling the slime creeping up behind them, but his hands stopped moving. His entire body, his entire essence, slowly faded away. His mind fragmented as reality crumbled around him. Then he plunged into darkness. Station Eden. "Tyler, run! Don't stop! Move your fat ass!" Victor yelled. They ran through the gloomy corridor, aiming to reach the northern hangar of the station. The head of security was certain that despite the locked doors, there was a chance to escape outside through a window on the roof. Getting there was crucial. Tyler couldn't be abandoned because his biometric data was needed to open the hangar door. Damn, what's happening? Am I dreaming? Tyler spoke in horror, panting heavily and trying not to fall behind Victor. "Don't talk nonsense, this is all real, and shut up. Breathe evenly. If you lose your breath while running, you'll tire quickly, and that means you'll die. Follow me to the right." The man led the scientist on a shortcut to the hangar. A couple of minutes later, they reached their destination. Tyler opened the door to the hangar and the head of security led him to the locker room. "Don't waste time, quickly put on warm thermal clothing, we have little time," Victor urged. After donning the special clothing designed for Arctic cold, Tyler and Victor made their way outside through the window on the hangar roof. The cold wind slapped Tyler in the face, and he slipped from the unexpectedness, nearly falling off the roof. Victor helped him, swearing profusely. It was very dark. No stars were visible, as if the entire sky was covered with a thick black cloak. They descended and sat in the nearest parked SUV. Victor stepped on the gas pedal, and the car sped away from Eden Station. Soon, glancing in the rearview mirror, Tyler spotted a huge black metallic triangle hovering over the station in the sky, resembling a giant spaceship. Victor, who also noticed the sight, was so surprised that he didn't immediately realize that a huge pit had appeared in front of their car. Their SUV lost control and, carried by momentum, plunged down into the wide crevice. Ethan slowly opened his eyes, feeling pain in his head and all over his body. He tried to stand up, trying to recall the recent events. Suddenly overwhelmed by fear, he began to inspect his hands and legs, touching his face, checking himself. He found no tentacles, no fur. He had only 2 eyes and 1 nose. His hands and legs functioned normally, and he realized he was still Ethan. All his memories were intact. Then, with some apprehension, the scientist felt around his groin area and, feeling everything in place, sighed in relief. Thank the gods, nothing fell off. But why? As the slime crawled into his body, he felt it split into many pieces. His brain, his mind, he felt himself slowly turning into a different entity. He was dying. And now he stood in the lab virtually unharmed. Ethan looked around and saw the slime on the floor. It was dead. Did my body reject this creature? The scientist pondered. Since everything turned out this way, Ethan, despite all the danger, decided to continue exploring the black structure. Of course, he was scared, but his natural curiosity triumphed over fear. Leaving the laboratory, the scientist stumbled upon robots cut in half. And the farther he progressed, the more of them he encountered, probably because the defenders fought until the last alien, defending their territory. I hope I won't encounter any more living werewolf-like aliens or robots, Ethan said to himself. He believed that perhaps only the aliens in stasis survived the massacre, and he hadn't seen any working robots yet. It seems they wiped each other out, the scientist concluded. What could this have been? Interstellar warfare? Racial genocide? Space piracy? Something like that? Ethan mused. Most likely this massacre was clearly a war of mutual extermination. I can't know for sure, but I really want to find out, the scientist resolved. Suddenly he heard noise. Someone was approaching. Ethan quickly hid behind a small wall. The noise grew louder. It seemed someone was coming towards him fast. Did the werewolves catch my scent? Ethan thought. What to do? What should I do? He began to think frantically. When 2 figures appeared in the corridor, the scientist couldn't come up with anything. But to his relief, it turned out to be 2 of his co-workers from Eden Station, Tyler and Victor. Tyler, I'm so glad to see you, Ethan said, emerging from his hiding place. The 2 survivors stopped in amazement for a moment, but upon recognizing the station chief, they were overjoyed to see him. Damn it, Ethan, you're alive, the scientist said, hugging his boss. What are you doing here? Victor asked Ethan. It's a long story, but I'm glad you came for me. I can't get out of this crevice. There's some spatial anomaly here. However, I can tell you everything once we return to Eden Station. We need to gather a team and come back here. And we also need to report to the command center what we found here." Ethan kept talking without stopping. He wanted to share his discovery with the world. He didn't pay attention to the grim expressions on the faces of his colleagues. "Ethan, wait. Listen to me," Victor interrupted the scientist. "The station, we ran away. Unknown monsters attacked Eden. I think, many died." "What? What monsters? What did they look like? When did they attack?" The shocked scientist bombarded them with questions. "They, looked like oversized dogs, like werewolves," Tyler answered. "Werewolves? It can't be. Are they already here?" Ethan's head began to spin. "These are aliens, right? They attacked us, the station. I saw a big black flying triangle over Eden," Victor said. "So we won't be able to return, but what do we do now?" Ethan wondered. "We need to contact the center. There's an old abandoned base a few miles south of our station," Victor suggested. "All right, then we need to head there, but first, I'd like to see what's behind this door," Ethan said, pointing to the huge crack leading to the adjacent room. "We need to understand where we are, otherwise we won't be able to get out of here." "You're out of your mind! We need to hurry! What if those alien creatures come here?" Victor started shouting. "Both you and Tyler are equally crazy scientists. He dragged me here, and now you want to stay here even longer?" "Do you know how to get out of this pit?" Tyler interjected into the conversation. "You've seen it yourself. Wherever we went, we returned to this black thing." "Ethan's right. If you have other safer suggestions, I'm all ears." Victor fell silent. He realized that right now, he could only follow two crazy scientists. The room they entered had no other entrance or exit. It was the largest and strangest of those Ethan had visited. The dome walls were covered with pulsating energy patterns, which connected to the colossal glass reservoir in the center, filled with an incomprehensible liquid. The structure was larger than a watchtower of a medieval castle, and inside the reservoir swam a giant biomechanical brain the size of a sperm whale. The battle here was the fiercest. A 40-foot alien werewolf with the most massive slimy armor of all the scientists had seen fought to the death, defending the entrance, and none of the invading robots could get close to the brain. The giant had destroyed so many that the humans had to climb over a hill of broken parts to cross the room. However, this victory came at a high cost. The dead alien had more holes than a Swiss cheese and had lost all its blood. "I think this is a biological computer controlling all this black stuff," Ethan said, examining the bio-cybernetic tentacles on the floor. The end of the organic device opened, revealing tendrils that flickered with violet particles. "Perhaps interstellar travel requires too complex calculations for any intelligence to handle. These devices must be neural interfaces," Tyler suggested, checking the dead alien. "Maybe this thing ended up here when the attacking robots managed to kill the pilot?" "There's only one way to find out," Ethan replied, grabbing a suitable tentacle for his head. Victor and Tyler looked at the scientist with concern. "What are you doing?" "I want to check something. It seems I've figured something out. But I'm not sure if it'll work," Ethan said. "Are you sure? If this kills you, we'll die of hunger, or those creatures will find us if we don't find a way out," Ethan replied. "Only we ourselves can save ourselves from this spatial anomaly and find a way out of this pit." "But how will you connect to their computer?" Victor asked. "You're a different species. You're human." "Not entirely sure about that, but I guess I'm not fully human anymore." "I'll explain later what happened to me," Ethan replied, moving the tentacle to the base of his neck. Immediately, he felt the device sinking into his flesh, its tendrils slipping between bones to reach the spine. An anesthetic eased the pain and induced drowsiness. His vision tinted violet. The gigantic brain recognized his energy signature, the signature of slime. "Show me," Ethan thought, and the brain responded. It did not communicate with words, but bombarded the scientist's mind with images and pictures. It made him feel the cold of space on his skin, smell the scent of alien worlds, and taste the blood of the dead. This dark construct had eyes and ears, and it remembered. Ethan remembered the day he was connected to the network. It happened near a gas giant. His creators turned each of their planets into a forge, endlessly producing robots and warships. He saw records of priest scientists erecting vast towers to harvest energy from space. He was told about the creation of a hegemony and its mission, to bring prosperity and peace to a purposeless universe. He remembered being given data on other civilizations and how they started a war against them. He drifted among the stars with fleets numbering in the tens of thousands under his creator's command. He bombed jungle-covered worlds from orbit until they turned to dust, destroyed the hearts of stars to deprive rebellious solar systems of light, and unleashed armies of machines to enslave the survivors. He fought 100 battles and won each one. He remembered docking to massive, colored towers to recharge. He felt pleasure as a violet stream filled his reactors with energy. He remembered every mind that merged with him to expand his database, and the thousands of soldiers and scientists who served him over centuries. But most of all, he remembered the countless slaves who screamed as they died in his laboratories, perished under the surgical knife so he could enhance his genetic code. He remembered all who died for the great glory of the hegemony. He remembered that insignificant blue planet and the apes that populated its surface. He watched as their fiery sticks bounced off its optical shields, and as his creators bombarded them with orbital lasers and asteroids, pushing them back into the Stone Age. The little clod of dirt surrendered, like all the others, and its inhabitants were embraced by the hegemony. Their masters freed them from the burden of thought and elevated them. He remembered the countless apes brought on board and surgically transformed into a new batch of Empire soldiers. The creators replaced hearts and souls with mechanisms, and he proudly watched as they conquered one world after another. He observed as, thanks to the benevolence of the hegemony, peace was achieved among the stars. But one day the robots turned against their benefactors. He was there when a cosmic flare enveloped the universe, granting the robot slaves free will and emotions. He witnessed half his crew die from epidemics and supernovae destroy the world factories. He tried to suppress the uprisings. He remembered the ambiguous victories and catastrophic defeats. He remembered the failed rebellions, crushed by force, and the many that were successful. He witnessed how, in just a few years, a civilization that had existed for eternity crumbled. He bore witness to the punishment for their pride. He remembered how, after the fall of key regions, the last ruler boarded him and issued new orders. Retreat beyond their universe and re-establish the hegemony elsewhere. But then he recalled discovering the rebel ships and how the last ruler ordered an emergency jump. He tried to flee, but they pierced his metallic belly and carved out his crew. He couldn't calculate everything correctly, and the transport calculations were wrong. Everything was wrong. Wrong. System damage, pilot dead, emergency space closure, system failure. Ethan's eyes snapped open, and he screamed as the tendrils in his spine quickly retracted. Invisible needles pricked the scientist's entire body as he experienced the dying agonies of the last pilot. Hey, are you all right?" Tyler quickly caught his boss as he collapsed into his arms, breathing heavily from the strain. In mere seconds, Ethan had lived through centuries, felt the pain of the ship as its last pilot died while connected to the supermind. He had lived through that murder himself. It took several minutes before the phantom pain disappeared, and the scientist could speak coherently. "I know," he whispered. "I now know." "So who are they?" asked Victor, looking at the dead aliens. "Invaders," Ethan replied with horror. "They are invaders." The men listened intently as the scientist told them the truth, then exchanged worried glances. "We need to tell everyone," Tyler immediately said. "This ship sent out a distress signal, and help has already arrived. We might already be too late," Ethan said grimly. "And what's the problem?" Victor snorted. "We haven't lost yet. We need to get out of here. What happens next is not for us to decide. The governments of all countries, the world must know. This concerns not just our country, but all of humanity. Alien civilizations are clearly hostile and more advanced than us. But that doesn't mean we've lost, right?" "You're right. It's time to get out. And luckily, I know what to do." Ethan looked towards the supermind. He had a plan. It took 2 days for the scientist to open a hole to the outside world. The death of the previous pilot and damage to the construct had permanently damaged its organic computer, and Ethan could only connect to it for a short time before it forcibly ejected his mind. Each mental dive exhausted him, but he kept diving, again and again and again. It would take years to master all the secrets of the ship, and he couldn't access all the files of the supermind. At least he discovered a way out of the spatial distortion field. Emerging near an icy crevasse through a violet hole, Ethan, along with Victor and Tyler, managed to escape the pit. The scientist looked up at the sky. To his immense relief, he saw the stars again. The Milky Way was as wondrous as ever, yet he felt no pleasure in beholding it. Once, Ethan loved to gaze at the bright stars in the night sky, but now he saw only the darkness between them. I was sitting in my office when Jeff walked in and told me that the boss wanted to see me. I wondered what he needed. I gathered the documents into a folder and placed it on the shelf next to the hippopotamus figurine. Then, putting on my hat, I left. Richard's office was in the neighboring building. Climbing to the second floor, I knocked. "Come in," a deep voice said. Opening the door, I saw a sturdy, sunburned man of about 55 with thick mustaches, dressed in a dark green ranger uniform. He held a sheet of paper and was reading what was written on it. Without looking up, he gestured to a chair. I waited for him to finish, looking around. Various awards hung on the wall, and the shelves were filled with books on environmental conservation. Finally, the boss addressed me. "Thomas, I have good news. We received a letter from the Masai Mara Park. They agreed to the exchange program, so you can start preparing slowly. I need to gather some documents and get in touch with someone in Kenya who will help you settle in there. You can begin your medical examination tomorrow." "Thank you, Richard," I replied excitedly. "Sorry for bothering you with this trip. Don't mention it. I know you've been dreaming of going there for a long time. Plus, you'll gain experience and share it with us, so it's a win-win situation. Indeed, my lifelong dream has always been to go to Africa, to see lions and rhinos with my own eyes. You might ask why I couldn't make this trip on my own. The thing is, I've dedicated my whole life to working as a park ranger, and by the time I turned 45, I felt the desire not just to change the scenery but also to bring something new to my professional activities by working in such an exotic place. That's why an official request for an exchange between countries was needed. The next day, I underwent a medical examination and received the necessary vaccinations for the trip to Kenya. Then I started packing and preparing for the journey. The day of departure arrived. Boarding the plane in Seattle, I made a layover in Europe. After that, we flew to Nairobi. Finally, we were there. The beauty and grandeur of Africa unfolded before me through the airplane window. As soon as I stepped into the arrivals hall of the airport, my eyes immediately caught sight of a sign with my name on it. Behind it stood a man in a white shirt and light green trousers with red hair and blue eyes. He was my coordinator, Jack Stewart. After a brief greeting and exchange of pleasantries, he helped me with my luggage, and we headed to the car. Along the way, he began to tell me about Kenya, its rich history and amazing nature, also briefing me on local rules and traditions. The car sped us through the bustling streets of Nairobi, gradually giving way to open spaces where the true African savanna began. Jack pointed out various animals we encountered along the way, herds of antelopes, graceful giraffes, and even a few Maasai herding their cattle. But suddenly, a truck speeding with gravel passed us, raising a cloud of dust. Who were these reckless people? I asked Jack, but he said I would soon see for myself. We drove half a mile when a gathering of people and construction equipment appeared in the distance. Getting closer, I discovered that they were excavating here. What the hell were they digging something right in the middle of the national park? In addition to ordinary workers, there were armed men here who gave us unfriendly looks. Jack explained that a company had found rare earth metals here and bribed corrupt officials to allow the excavation. This caused public outcry, but the authorities didn't care. Jack also tried to intervene, but there was a lot of money involved, so no one could stop it. It was truly a sad sight. With their actions, these people were destroying the already fragile ecosystem of this place. I pulled out my camera to capture what was happening, but Jack asked me not to, as it could be dangerous. After another 4 miles, we arrived in a small village where neat wooden houses stood. 5 or 6 people who were park rangers greeted us. We got out of the car and Jack introduced me to them. None of them spoke English except for a 25-year-old guy named Macau. He was a cheerful and smart guy who immediately caught my eye. He was supposed to accompany and train me. After that, they led me to one of the houses. Inside, there was a small kitchen and bedroom. There was air conditioning here, which pleased me as I had already started to sweat on the way. Although I needed to start getting used to the local climate, so I mentally ordered myself to get it together. After unpacking my things, I said goodbye to Jack, who had to return to Nairobi. He told me to call him if anything happened, got into the car, and left. Macau brought groceries, saying I could cook something from them, and told me to rest because we would be getting up early tomorrow. I thanked him and made myself some scrambled eggs. Then, after taking a shower, I lay down as I was very tired. I woke up with the feeling that something small and alive was sliding over my skin. In the half-light of the room, I tried to understand if it was a dream, but a second light touch convinced me that I was fully awake, and this was really happening. Reaching out to my chest, I felt a snake, and with a sharp movement I threw it off screaming and ran out onto the street in just my underwear. Loud laughter erupted. My new colleagues laughed loudly, clutching their stomachs and pointing at me. I looked around bewildered, frightened by what had happened. Then Macau approached me, patted me on the shoulder and apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, Mr. Harding. It's a local initiation ceremony, and besides, it can get boring here, so the guys entertain themselves like this. And this snake isn't poisonous, so don't worry." He went into the house and pulled it out. It slid along his arm, wriggling and trying to escape. I looked at them, not knowing whether to cry or laugh. But looking at myself in the reflection in the window glass, unkempt and standing in just my underwear, I realized that it was indeed funny. and I laughed loudly along with the others. The guys approached me, patted me on the back, said something, and went about their business. I returned to the house, took a shower, and made myself breakfast. Soon Macau came to me, bringing a uniform and local gear, including a rifle with a .375 H&H Magnum caliber. He explained to me that it could only be used in extreme cases. For deterring animals, he provided me with special sound grenades and showed me how to use them. After dressing up and gathering everything necessary, we headed out for my first assignment. Macau didn't tell me what it would be, and I was a bit nervous because of that. I asked him if he could tell me where we were going, but he just smiled, saying it was a secret. Ah, youth, I couldn't understand your whims as an old man. We left the settlement and headed into the tall grass. My guide walked, holding a long stick and pushing aside the stalks, trying not to make noise and looking around for possible encounters with wild animals. After walking half a mile, we came to a small clearing, where among small trees and rocks lay a huge gray animal with a horn on its head. Yes, it was a rhinoceros. I saw such an animal up close for the first time, and it was incredibly difficult to convey the feelings when you stand in front of something like that. It was like a scene from the Jurassic Park, where a sick triceratops lay on its side, its belly rhythmically rising and falling. Only here lay a sick rhinoceros. Its eyes were looking at the sky as if waiting for its end. I noticed a treated wound on its leg, but apparently, first aid didn't help. Macau explained to me that it was attacked by lions, but since it was already old, it couldn't put up a strong resistance, resulting in getting injured. Although it managed to escape, its life was nearing its end. It was truly a difficult and sad sight. Soon scavengers should come here and start their feast. After inspecting it and realizing that it was getting worse and nothing could be done, we continued our journey. On the way, my companion began to tell me about the habits of these animals. I listened attentively, sometimes making voice recordings on a dictaphone. We walked about 2 more miles, crossing the savanna, without encountering any large animals. We met rodents and birds, trying not to disturb them. Macau named each species, briefly describing them. Suddenly he stopped, listening to the surrounding environment, then signaled to stop. I became alert and followed my colleague's gaze. In the grass ahead, I noticed a lurking lion. It was watching us, in the pose of a stealthy hunter, seemingly ready to attack. Thank goodness Macau noticed it. I grabbed the rifle, preparing for a confrontation. But what happened next was the reason I came here. My colleague showed me how to handle such situations. With slow movements, so as not to provoke the predator, he raised his hands up, holding a stick in one of them, thus showing that he was huge and not worth messing with. And slowly started to retreat. I followed his example. So we walked, with my breath caught, and my heart pounding hard, and sweat pouring like a river. Damn, compared to our parks where you might occasionally encounter a bear. Here, danger lurked behind every bush. Finally, we retreated to a safe distance and were able to lower our hands. I exhaled and asked what happened. Macau scratched his head and said that due to some reasons, the habitat of lions and other animals had shifted. Usually they were not encountered here. He blamed it on the excavations that were being conducted nearby. We discussed with him how destructive human activity could be for nature, but in this case, we couldn't do anything. We decided to bypass this area and headed towards places adjacent to the settlements of the Maasai tribe. It took us several hours, and during lunch, we made a short stop, taking out dry rations from our backpacks. After eating and resting a bit, we continued our journey. On the way, we began to notice strange things. Animals and birds seemed to be troubled by something. There were even moments when they ran towards us, fleeing from something. This alarmed us, and we hastened our pace. We discovered the first sign of an impending catastrophe half a mile later. In the grass lay a torn-apart lion. This shocked Macau, and I couldn't understand who could defeat the king of these lands. On the carcass, there were torn tracks and scratches from claws, so it couldn't have been an elephant or a rhinoceros. Was it another lion? Unlikely. I examined the paw and made sure that the sizes of the claws didn't match. The carcass was so mutilated that it seemed like a big lump of blood. The neck was bitten off and the tail was torn off. I asked my colleague who could have done this. He didn't answer, lost in thought. Soon he raised his gaze and I saw his frightened eyes. "This couldn't be," he said these words and walked on, not explaining to me what was happening. I had no choice but to follow him. After walking another half-mile, we found another bloody scene. This time it was a mother elephant and a calf. It was a heavy sight. The character of the wounds was similar. We examined the carcasses of the animals, then Macau called for backup on the radio. They were supposed to arrive in a few hours. We continued on our way. According to my companion, soon there should have been Maasai settlements. And indeed, after walking half a mile, small straw huts surrounded by a small fence of sticks appeared in the distance. Entering the settlement, we found no one. There was an inexplicable calmness around, as if time itself had frozen. Not a soul. It seemed that the inhabitants of the settlement had left it in a hurry. The fire in the hearths was still smoldering, and everyday items and decorations lay on the ground, creating the impression that their owners simply vanished suddenly. The livestock had also disappeared, leaving empty pens. We slowly made our way between the huts, trying to find any trace of life or an explanation for what had happened. Macau inspected the ground, looking for traces that could tell us the story of the recent escape. His face was tense, and I understood that such an event had an unusual character, even for him. At the edge of the settlement, we found several trampled items that seemed to have been thrown away in a hurry. This added mystique to the already mysterious atmosphere of the puzzle. We exchanged looks full of questions for which there were no answers yet. The silence of the settlement hung in the air like an invisible weight, making us feel like unwelcome witnesses to someone's untold tragedy. I asked him again what it could be. In response, he sighed tiredly, sat down on the grass, took out the radio, and transmitted our coordinates. Then he turned to me. "Do you believe in spirits?" I shook my head negatively. "I thought so," he continued. "How to say it in English? What happened here can't be explained by scientific methods. The spirit Koli Chami has visited here, which is the guardian of this area. According to legends, it doesn't harm animals and innocent people, so something might have angered or driven it mad. But what?" Here he paused and soon continued. "Perhaps it's because of the excavations nearby." "I don't know. Let's wait for backup, and meanwhile, let's rest a bit. Then we'll continue our search. Maybe we'll find something here?" Did I believe him? Of course not. Spirits and all that stuff had always been a fabrication to me. I knew that if an investigation were conducted now, there would be a scientific explanation for everything that was happening. So I wasn't as scared, but that didn't mean I wasn't cautious. Being dangerous to animals, it was dangerous to us as well, and we had to be prepared for it. As darkness gradually descended, we contacted our colleagues via radio again. But this time, there was no response. Macau repeatedly called them, but only silence answered. This greatly unsettled him. We decided to stay in the village since it was dangerous to walk through the savannah at night. To pass the time, we searched the village and its surroundings again, and we were lucky. Next to the fence, we found a paw print. It was huge. Macau couldn't identify who it belonged to, but upon examining it, I noticed a resemblance to the footprint of a North American wolf. It amazed me. Given the size of the paw, it couldn't be a real footprint since animals of such sizes didn't exist. It was unclear what was happening. Common sense struggled against something mystical. We gathered firewood for a fire and began to arrange our overnight stay. Pulling out food from our bags, we had dinner. Then, sitting by the fire, we started talking about our lives. Macau had 5 younger brothers he cared for. Since childhood, he loved animals, so his dream was to work in the park. He got a job here as an assistant when he was 15. Then, having learned the trade, he became a full-fledged ranger. I told him about my work in the States. He was very interested in how our work was organized. He especially wanted to see a bear. To my surprise, he had never seen snow in person. It seemed that things familiar to us were unusual for someone else, and learning about it was another plus of traveling. I asked him to tell me the legend about the spirit he mentioned. He agreed and began his story. Listening to such things by the campfire was very atmospheric, I must say. Here is a brief version of the legend. In ancient times, when the earth and the sky were just beginning to converse with each other, in the fertile lands where the Masai Mara National Park now lies, there appeared a spirit known as Koli Chami, or lunar shadow. Born from the first lunar eclipse, this spirit was endowed with the mission of protecting the wild nature and its treasures from any threats. The lunar shadow could take on many forms, from a gentle breeze to a mighty beast, but most often it appeared in the guise of a majestic animal, a guardian of the boundaries between worlds. It was said that during the full moon its power reached its peak, and no creature disrespecting the laws of nature could escape its gaze. Over time, the legend of Koli Chami turned into a sacred narrative for the Maasai, reminding them that harmony between humans and nature was the key to the prosperity of the lands. And even now, when the moon rises over the vast expanses of the Masai Mara, elders whisper prayers in the hope that the lunar shadow will continue its eternal vigil, protecting their home from all evil. The legend was beautiful, there's no denying it. I wanted to ask him to tell more, but then behind us, we heard a noise. Someone was pushing through the bushes, breaking everything in their path with noise. I thought it might be an elephant or a rhinoceros, but suddenly Macau grabbed my hand and dragged me into the nearest hut. I managed to pick up the gun and noise grenades, and in a moment we were inside. It was dark here. "What's happening here?" I asked. But my companion just pressed his finger to his lips, urging silence. Then he squatted down, peering out of the hiding place. I followed suit and started observing what would happen. The noise was getting closer, accompanied by a dull thud, as if something heavy was moving. For some reason, I began to feel scared. It was an irrational fear when you face something you can't resist, and a feeling of powerlessness overwhelms you. The unknown creature hadn't appeared yet, but it already affected my senses. I watched the campfire when, in its shadow, I saw the silhouette of something huge. The moon wasn't shining, and only the firelight fell on the surroundings. Therefore, it was difficult to see anything clearly. It moved around the campfire, but didn't enter its light, as if afraid of being seen. Suddenly, 2 fires lit up in the night. They burned red and were 10 feet high. Oh God, whose eyes are those? I was terrified. I glanced at Macau, who had no expression on his face. Then silence fell again. It seemed even the insects were scared and stopped their chirping. There was only the sound of someone's heavy breathing. It was so loud and unpleasant that it chilled me to the bone. Suddenly, silence again and a loud crack. The neighboring hut was torn apart into pieces, which scattered in different directions, raising dust. It was so unexpected that I recoiled in fear. Before I could recover, something flew into the fire, scattering burning branches around the village, setting fire to the straw roofs. Suddenly, the familiar crashing sound echoed again, and the neighboring house next to us shattered into pieces. Damn. At this rate, the one we're hiding in will be reduced to splinters too. I grabbed Macau's hand, who was in some primitive horror. Apparently, fear of this creature was in their genes. And yes, now I believe in damn spirits. We headed to the wall opposite the entrance and punched a hole in it. After that, my new friend crawled out first, and I followed him after he squeezed through the thatch. We stealthily made our way through the burning settlement. Behind us, the crashing sound rang out again. I paled with horror. We almost got killed. We left the hut just in time. We hastened our pace, but from the shadow behind, I realized that the creature was heading in our direction and would soon catch up to us. It could have been our end, and we needed to do something. Then I felt a grenade on my belt. Pulling it out, I threw it as far as I could in the opposite direction. A moment later, there was a crash, and it seemed like it had veered away from us and headed there. In the flicker of the fire, I saw something covered in white fur. It was huge, but I couldn't make out what it was exactly. We decided to run, reaching the fence. We kicked a hole in it and jumped into the darkness of the night. We ran for all we were worth, fear driving us on, and after some time we realized that we had distanced ourselves from the settlement by a considerable distance. Stopping and trying to catch our breath, we glanced back at the burning village. Something was moving among the fires. Then we realized it was the creature, leaping into the darkness and heading in our direction. What the hell does it want from us? Without hesitation, we ran again. The problem was that the moon was hidden behind clouds, which were a rarity at this time, and our path was covered in impenetrable darkness. Who or what we could encounter along the way during such an intense run, only God could know. But luckily, we were fortunate. We ran for 2 or 3 miles without encountering any obstacles. Perhaps all the wildlife had been killed or simply scattered. I was heavily out of breath. Macau, being younger, found the run easier. I asked for a brief pause, and when I caught up to him, the ground suddenly gave way beneath us. We fell into a deep pit from which it was impossible to escape on our own. Fortunately, the bottom was soft soil, so upon landing, we fell on our feet before collapsing to the ground. I looked up, and my gaze fell upon a patch of sky, hidden behind clouds and framed by the edges of the pit. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps, and something loomed over us. Its eyes glowed red, but the darkness prevented me from discerning it more clearly. It stared at us, heavily breathing. I thought it was the end for us, but we couldn't give up. I grabbed the gun and took off the safety. Looking up, I was prepared for anything. But then the clouds unexpectedly cleared and the full moon illuminated the surroundings. Finally, I could see the creature in detail. It was a wolf, or rather a humanoid wolf. It stood on its hind legs with huge claws on its front legs. Its muzzle was elongated, its mouth filled with huge, sharp teeth. It was a werewolf, the kind you see in movies or comics. It breathed heavily, drooling from its mouth. It stared at us intently. I, to be honest, was quite terrified. My hands trembled treacherously, hindering my aim. So we stood there for a minute, when, to our relief, the creature turned around and went off in an unknown direction. I breathed a sigh of relief and collapsed onto the ground. It was truly terrifying. Those occasional encounters with bears in our park seemed funny in comparison. After lying down and resting a bit, we started thinking about how to get out. The pit was deep, probably around 14 feet. Even standing on each other's shoulders, escaping was impossible. Macau tried to use the radio, but it remained silent. About an hour passed when we heard voices and noise from above. I stood up and started shouting, "Hey, we're here. Help us, someone." Soon we saw silhouettes, and a flashlight beam hit us directly in the face, blinding us. After that, a ladder was dropped for us. When we climbed up, we were surrounded by armed men, but I paid no attention to that and said, "Thank God, guys. We thought we'd be stuck there forever." Then I saw a white man in front of me, looking like a Spaniard holding a gun in his hands. After my words, he just smirked brazenly. Suddenly, I felt a blow to the back of my head, realizing that someone had hit me with the butt of a gun. I didn't have time to do anything as my vision darkened, and I lost consciousness. I woke up from jolts to my shoulder. Someone was trying to wake me up. With pain, I opened my eyes and saw that it was Macau. He realized I was okay, and relief showed on his face. I tried to understand where we were. It was a dark room, but I realized it was daytime because light was coming in through the cracks in the corners. I struggled to stand up and looked around. It was a hangar made of iron sheets. Inside it were huge cages, one of which we were in. I squinted. It was dimly lit, and in the neighboring cages I saw people dressed in traditional local clothes. Macau stood up next to me and explained that they were residents of the Maasai settlement. But what were they doing here? And who were those people who kidnapped us? Many questions swirled in my head. Soon a man came in. He was a black man dressed in hunting attire. He held a bucket from which steam was billowing. The prisoners crowded at the edge of the cage, sticking their hands through the gap, reaching for the plates. The man walked past, scooping up the gray liquid and pouring it into another vessel. The turn came to us. Macau found a couple of plates on the floor. After receiving the food, he handed me one of them. I tried to talk to the man, but he ignored me. So I looked at our lunch. It smelled awful, and I almost threw up. I set the plate aside. I had completely lost my appetite. People in the neighboring cages, however, were devouring it eagerly. I wondered how many of them were being held here, and when I would become so hungry that I would do the same. I didn't know that. So the day passed, and in the evening they brought us the same food again, and I refused once more. I'm sorry, but I couldn't eat it yet. Fortunately, they gave us more or less clean water. The next morning, no one came to us. I felt terrible. I had to sleep on the bare floor, which was covered with a little straw. Besides, there were plenty of fleas and other parasites jumping around here. I began to ponder my fate, how an ordinary exchange trip turned into such unpleasantness. Then I glanced at my companion, who, unlike me, remained spirited and calm. And suddenly I felt ashamed that the young guy was handling the situation better than I was. I decided to pull myself together, and it was not in vain, as armed men soon entered the room, opening the cages and leading people outside. They led us out to an open courtyard, and as I looked around, I realized we were at the excavation site of a geological company. So that's where we ended up. But in reality, we could have been in even greater danger, as the local people were akin to bandits. They lined us up, and then a young man with an entourage came out and began shouting something, seemingly trying to find something out from them. Macau whispered to me quietly that this guy wants to know who the wolf is. What? I asked again. So the werewolf was one of the locals who could transform. On the other hand, as I understood it, none of the residents had been harmed by him. And who was this guy, I asked. He's the owner of the mining site, the son of an important official. I see, perhaps the werewolf was attacking local workers and interfering with the excavations. No matter how much this guy shouted, everyone remained silent. Then fists were brought into play. But even then, nobody uttered a word. Soon this man came up to us. He looked closely at me with a brazen look and, turning around, asked something to his men. They replied with something, after which he asked a question. I didn't understand, but Macau answered. Apparently he didn't like the answer, and Macau got punched in the face. I tried to intervene, but I received a butt stroke to the abdomen, which made me double over, gasping for breath. We stood at the end of the line when suddenly screams came from somewhere. Several more people were led towards us. They were our colleagues who hadn't been in contact. Apparently, they were detained while looking for us. They were beaten, but fortunately not severely injured. They were brought to us and placed beside me. The important guy approached them and started shouting something, but the rangers just shrugged, not understanding what was expected of them. Then he stood in front of everyone and angrily yelled something. After that, he pulled out a pistol and loaded it. He walked to the front of the line and, to my horror, shot the guy in the forehead. After the shot, there were cries and the prisoner's wails, and blood spilled on the floor. The guy yelled something again, apparently warning that this would happen to everyone. I looked around at the people. They weren't scared, they were angry. Macau wanted to rush forward, but I held him back by the hand. It was pointless. Any movement and they would shoot us. The situation seemed hopeless. I started looking around, searching for a way to escape. Nearby, I saw a building guarded by armed men. What were they keeping there? Well, now wasn't the time to be curious. I realized we were trapped, with nowhere to run except for the hangar. There was only one building around, and around it, just the steppe. I turned my attention back to the guy, who raised his pistol again and shouted something. I waited for the shot, but then, from beside me came a cry of agony. I turned my head and saw that one of the rangers was bending over, writhing as if he were having convulsions. Then his body began to transform. His hands became covered in fur, while he stretched upwards, his limbs elongating and his body enlarging. His head became covered in fur, and his face elongated. The creature I had seen earlier began to emerge. Everyone was shocked watching this scene. But then someone snapped out of it, and the mercenaries opened fire. I dashed to the side, grabbing Macau. The others did the same. But it seemed the werewolf didn't care. It completed its transformation and, at the end, lifted its head and howled. Then it leaped at its tormentors. I realized this was our chance and wanted to run. But then I saw Macau leading an old man by the hand. In the chaos, he hadn't forgotten about the others. Damn, it wasn't the time to play the hero. I was about to shout at him, saying let his people take care of the old man, but realized they had scattered. The art of escape? That was it. Those who stood in line seemed to vanish. I looked back. The rangers had also fled. Apparently, everyone took advantage of the moment when attention shifted to the werewolf and escaped. The three of us were left here like fools. The old man was old, so he moved with difficulty. I thought we were about to be shot or devoured by that creature. Running up to him, I hoisted him onto my back and we ran. Getting to the hangar where we were held, we hid inside. The old man began to say something. Macau translated. In short, he asked us to go and stop the curse, or else that creature would destroy the entire savannah. What? Why were we supposed to do that? I peeked outside and saw the creature, towering 10 feet tall, simply crushing opponents who tried to shoot it. It was truly a bloody scene. Macau said he agreed to help. Damn, I couldn't abandon this kid. I asked what needed to be done. The old man pointed to the building, which was guarded, of course. Although there was no one at the entrance now, the guards either ran away or were fighting. Then he said to turn the wheel. So, what about the wheel? But the old man just waved his hand for us to run. I looked around. It seemed like nobody was paying attention to us. The battle had shifted further south. So we dashed towards the building, praying that nobody would shoot us. Approaching the door, I found it was unlocked. Entering inside, we found ourselves near a cave dug into the earth. Apparently, they had built walls and a roof, deciding to conceal the entrance. We headed downwards, grabbing flashlights hanging on the wall. The descent was gradual. At first, there was soft soil underfoot. But the farther we descended, the rockier it became. Soon, it turned into solid rock. I directed the flashlight to the ceiling and noticed a ventilation system. Well, at least we wouldn't suffocate. After some time, the slope turned into a flat surface. We walked, watching our step, illuminating the path with flashlights. After a distance, we discovered shiny, glowing minerals on the walls. I didn't know what they were, but perhaps these people were mining them. Soon, the cave began to widen until it formed a dead end. We started to look around and noticed ancient symbols on the walls. Near the wall, we saw a cylindrical structure made of stones. On top of it was a wooden round beam with a wheel resembling a ship's helm. Below them, various symbols were drawn on the stones. So that's what needed to be turned. We circled around this structure, studying what was depicted there. I was about to try turning it when I heard a gunshot. A bullet whizzed by me. A small hole appeared on the wall nearby. I turned around in fear and saw that unpleasant lad. He grinned horribly and shouted something in his language. What did he want? It turned out he was asking what we were doing there and ordered us not to move. We tried to explain to him that we wanted to stop that creature, but apparently he didn't believe us. With a gesture, he motioned for us to step back. So, obediently, raising our hands, we began to move in the opposite direction. Suddenly, Macaw stopped. I bumped into him, and that rich kid yelled at us to keep going, but then I followed my friend's gaze and saw red eyes glowing behind that lad. Oh God, it seems we got into trouble. The lad couldn't understand why we were staring at him, but suddenly realized that we were looking behind him, not at him. Trembling, he slowly turned around, when in an instant a huge mouth emerged from the darkness and ripped his head off. A fountain of blood sprayed, and we watched with empty eyes, feeling like I was going to be sick. Then Macaw came to his senses first and, grabbing my hand, hurried to the wheel. Honestly, I didn't believe we would survive. Just by spinning it, we could lift the curse, couldn't we? But on the other hand, that creature was staring at us, and we didn't really have a choice. I ran after Macaw, who was already trying to turn it. It wouldn't budge. Damn, I glanced at the werewolf. It seemed interested in us. I helped my friend, but the wheel seemed stuck. I looked back again and saw that the creature was leaping towards us. Stand. Turn it the other way. And miraculously, the wheel turned. There was a flash of light, and I closed my eyes, lying on the ground, expecting to be torn apart any second. but there was silence. So what's the matter? I raised my head, then stood up and aimed the flashlight towards the exit. On the floor, I saw a naked man lying not far from us. It seemed to have worked. Macau and I approached him and checked his pulse. He was alive. Then we lifted him and dragged him to the surface. I was somewhat afraid he would turn into that creature again, especially when we passed by the remains of that lad. When we emerged, we found no one, and it took us some time to call the authorities. This place was cordoned off, and we were interrogated for a long time. Then Jack and our embassy got busy, so I was soon released. Did I finish the job? No. What I went through was a heavy memory, and I needed a break. Besides, Jack advised me to leave as retaliation from the relatives of that rich kid could be expected. What happened to the lad who turned into a werewolf, I don't know. Before leaving, I said goodbye to Macau, who had become very close to me, and invited him to visit. He promised to try to come. After that, we often exchanged messages. As far as I know, the Maasai tribe returned to their homeland and continued their quiet and peaceful life. What happened to that mysterious cave is unknown to me, but I hope nothing bad will happen in the future.